Chapter 40. No one would have thought that Chu Qingyan, who had always been obedient in front of them, would cry like this. It was only at this moment that everyone remembered that this little girl was just a child. Everyone looked at each other, and in the end, they all looked at the motionless lord in the room. Xiao Su did not think that this girl would do this to him. Seeing her roll around on the floor, he felt that it was new and funny. This was not the first time someone dared to make a scene in front of him. Who didn't know that he always liked peace and quiet? No one dared to make a scene in front of him. This Chu Qingyan was not the first, but she was the first one who didn't arouse his disgust. Xiao Su looked at her and did not say anything. The people who had been whispering gradually quieted down because of their master's silence. Thus, the entire room suddenly became silent. Meanwhile, Chu Qingyan, who was still in a state of grief, gradually calmed down after crying her heart out. She never thought that there would be a day where she would cry like a child without caring about her image. Could it be that she was too immersed in her role? Or that the sadness in her heart had been aroused? But no matter what the reason was, it was a fact that she had cried. She was embarrassed as she secretly opened her fingers and carefully observed Xiao Su's reaction. She saw that he was still sitting on the chair with a teacup in his hand. His appearance was the same as before. His face was covered by the mask and she couldn't see his expression. But that pair of eyes that were as deep as ink were looking at her. He seemed to be indifferent and she couldn't see his emotions. Since she had already lost her composure, there was no need to pretend to be respectful. She might as well smash the pot that was already broken. His Royal Highness, did Qingyan offend you in any way? Is that why you punished Qingyan like this? Her hoarse voice was unspeakably pitiful. In reality, Xiao Su was not indifferent. It was just that he usually faced large and rough soldiers and servant girls who were much older than her. He had never interacted with children who were as old as her. Or it could be said that when children saw him, if they didn't walk around him, they would hide far away. So he had no chance to deal with this situation. He had been hesitating, but seeing her speak first, he felt a sense of relief. No. He calmly replied. Chu Qingyan heaved a sigh of relief when she heard his reply. Luckily, her actions had not angered him. Otherwise, she would have been thrown out of the courtyard. It was one thing to be embarrassed, but what if everyone in the residence was a bunch of snobs who flattered the powerful and stepped on the weak? Then, her life in the residence would be even more difficult. Then why do you keep making things difficult for Qingyan? Chu Qingyan fearlessly put down her hand and stared at the person in front of her with teary eyes. Chu Qingyan did not know when she had gained the courage to look the legendary cold-blooded and heartless Ghost King in the eyes. However, she did not feel the coldness coming from him at all. He was clearly a cold and aloof lord. Why did people always make him sound so scary? Do you think that this king has the time to make things difficult for you? The pair of large eyes in front of him were clear like they had been washed by water. It made him feel a little dazed, like he was looking at the clear sky after the snow had stopped. A gentle breeze blew across his heart, making him feel a little itchy. His calm tone had a questioning tone that made Chu Qingyan feel a little dazed. She was also a little confused. He did not need to make things difficult for her, but with those eyes staring at her, she felt like he was thinking of something, but she couldn't say for a while. However, Chu Qingyan's hands were clenched into fists on both sides of her thighs. Since it was like this, there was only one explanation left. Chu Qingyan did not know what her words would bring her, but she had no other choice. Everything had to be said out loud. She instantly raised her head with the courage to cut off all means of retreat before quickly hiding it in the depths of her eyes. Xiao Su was also stunned by her action. He thought in his heart, could it be that his plan had succeeded? His Royal Highness, Qingyan knows that you must be very dissatisfied with this marriage bestowed by His Majesty. After all, Qingyan has no talent, no virtue, no looks, and is young. My family is poor, so I won't be able to help you in the future. If you are dissatisfied because of this, Qing Yan is very sorry, but this is not something that Qing Yan can solve. Qing Yan also doesn't want to enter a noble family at such a young age. Things that don't belong to Qing Yan doesn't dare to take them. If you don't want to see Qing Yan will definitely not come to you to make things difficult for you. I guarantee that I will be obedient and won't cause any trouble for you. Is this all right? Her humble tone and fawning expression made people forget that these words came from the mouth of a 10-year-old girl. Many of the servants present looked down on Chu Qingyan, who was so humble. As expected, she came from a lowly family and was not worthy of their lord. Chu Qingyan had already felt the disdain and ridicule around her. She smiled in her heart as she had achieved her goal. But when she met the gaze of the people above, Chu Qingyan had the illusion that she had been stripped naked in front of him. How could a prince have any objections to imperial father's decree? Ninth young mistress, I'm afraid that you have misunderstood something. Or perhaps, you are not satisfied with this marriage. Xiao Su looked at her with a cold gaze. Chu Qingyan did not think that he would turn the tables on her. Her mouth was slightly open as she stood there in a daze. If this crime was decided by him, then she would not be able to bear it. Fortunately, Xiao Su did not dwell on this point. He suddenly stood up and walked in front of her. He slightly leaned forward to look at her. Deep in his black eyes, there was a faint light that appeared and disappeared, bringing with it a trace of enchantment. If there was a chance for you to leave the palace, would you dare to agree? Even his voice was filled with temptation. This opportunity was very tempting, but if she left the palace, wouldn't that mean that the bride would run away from this marriage? Wouldn't that mean that she would be defying the decree? Defying the decree would implicate 9 generations of the family. The Chu family did not have much to do with her, but she could not implicate her father and mother. Thinking of how he had tortured her before, he probably did not have any good intentions when he made this suggestion. She was almost bewitched by him. Chu Qingyan immediately sobered up. Her face was filled with righteousness as she righteously shook her head. His Royal Highness, how could Qingyan not be satisfied with this marriage? As for the opportunity you mentioned just now, Qingyan had never thought about it and would never agree. That's really a pity. Xiao Su straightened his body and lightly said. He originally wanted to let her go, but unfortunately, she did not cherish it. So don't blame him. If Chu Qingyan knew what kind of opportunity she had given up at this time, it would be too late for regrets. You don't want to get up early to eat breakfast with this prince? After the heavy blow just now, another heavy blow came. Chapter 41. Sigh. You're not willing to get up early to eat breakfast with this prince? Xiao Su still spoke in an unhurried tone, and no emotion could be detected from his voice. They finally came back to the original point, but when it came from Xiao Su's mouth, it sounded a bit strange. Chu Qingyan wiped the tears on her face and said in a choked voice, It's not that Qingyan doesn't want to eat with Lord, but it's because the courtyard is a bit far and I'm afraid that I won't make it in time and will delay Lord's morning court. If she kept denying it, it would seem a bit fake, so it was easier to believe in half-truths. Xiao Su nodded, You're thinking of this prince like this, and this prince is not an unreasonable person. Since it's like this, you won't have to get up early. Chu Qingyan choked. She was being let off this easily. She thought that she would need to spend a lot of effort to convince him. But Chu Qingyan still felt that it was a bit unbelievable. If this person was so easy to talk to, then what was the point of all the things she did in the past few days? And her crying without caring about her image today? But it was a good thing that children did not have any image to speak of, so she did not care if she lost face or not. Thank you, Lord. Lord really is a good person with a big heart. Chu Qingyan said with a grin. Xiao Su looked at her harmless face, without any of the fierce and crying appearance from before. He understood that women were indeed one of the 2 creatures in this world that could not be offended. But he did want to tease her. Is that so? But this prince is not so magnanimous as to ignore being grabbed by the collar. Although this prince does not want to argue with you, this prince is still a prince of a country. If I let you go on like this, I'm afraid that someone will learn from you and embarrass this prince. Then where will this prince's dignity be? In the end, he still brought up the matter that she had purposely ignored. Chu Qingyan was a bit discouraged. What was to come could not be avoided. Qingyan lost her head for a moment. It's Qingyan's fault. Qingyan will accept any punishment without any complaints. Chu Qingyan's head drooped. She wanted to cry, but no tears came out. This was simply settling scores at an opportune time. The King of England was not someone to be trifled with. But this king doesn't seem to have the habit of arguing with a child. Xiao Su turned around and sat back down on the chair. The tea on the table had already been changed. He picked up the teacup and lifted the lid with one hand. Through the smoke from the tea, he looked at the petite girl. If you can find a reason to convince this king to let you go, then this king will let bygones be bygones. Chu Qingyan was surprised by his sudden change, but worried that he would change his mind at any time. Chu Qingyan focused on thinking of a way to deal with it. This king is not a very patient person, so, the threat behind was self-evident. Chu Qingyan did not care about anything else and blurted out, His Royal Highness, Qingyan is young and ignorant. As the saying goes, the ignorant are innocent. Please be magnanimous and don't argue with a child. I'm just a child who doesn't know anything. If you want to make things difficult for me, then go ahead. But you will end up with the image of someone who haggles over every detail. It's up to you to choose. It's barely acceptable. Xiao Su lowered his eyes and drank his tea, as if he did not hear the hidden meaning in her words. Seeing that she had passed, Chu Qingyan let out a big sigh of relief. Because she was relaxed at this time, she began to feel tired, sleepy, and hungry. She had come here early in the morning, and after crying and making a fuss, it was not strange at all that she was tired and hungry. But the person in front of her was sitting like a clock, as if he had no intention of leaving. If he did not leave, how could she go back to her own courtyard to rest early? So she, kindly, reminded him, Lord, it's getting late. Are you still not going to morning court? Everyone suddenly glared at her with this question. Chu Qingyan was startled. She had only casually mentioned it, so why did she provoke everyone's anger? Just as she was scratching her head in confusion, the person in front of her slowly answered her question. This king does not need to go to morning court during this time. It was like a bolt from the blue. Even when she walked out of Yuxian courtyard, she was still in a daze and her footsteps were unsteady. Xining did not know what happened to her master inside, but when she walked out, she looked like she had lost her soul, giving people the illusion that she had nothing left to live for. At this time, she stared at her master, who was afraid of doing something stupid, and suddenly squatted down while supporting herself against the wall. She quickly followed and heard her master mumbling to herself. Bastard, I want to draw a circle to curse you. Xining's head was filled with questions. What did this mean? If she knew that he didn't need to go to morning court, why would she fight with him these past few days? She even fought with him today and made a fool of herself. This Xiao Su's heart was simply black to the extreme. She was happy for half a day after receiving his permission, but now he didn't even need to go to morning court. He also didn't need to eat breakfast with her this early. She had to draw a circle to curse him. After Chu Qingyan left, the Hualing walked in with a smile on his face. The earth spirit, on the other hand, looked as if someone owed him 1,000,000. Master, I heard that the Chu family's young miss was angered quite badly by you. Hualing said with a smile. She's just a child. Xiao Su thought of that pink little face turning red and he couldn't help finding it funny. Turin gave a soft laugh, Lord, this person is rude and rude. You don't need to worry about her at all. Hearing Turin's words, Hualing's ears immediately perked up. He looked at his master with a curious expression, Master, this subordinate has been feeling that your actions aren't normal. Hearing Turin say this, could it be that you have other plans for this Chu family's young miss? Xiao Su looked at him and did not reply. Turan on the side said with a cold smile, "When will that blockhead of yours be enlightened? You can't even see such a simple thing." Being slandered by Turan in front of his master, Wu Ling wanted to refute him to win back some face, but he heard Turan's next words. The reason why master did this was just to provoke her into giving up on this marriage. Being pointed out by Turan, Wu Ling finally understood. He clapped his hands and said with a smile, "No wonder master would eat at the same table with her and endure her unreasonable tantrums. It turns out that you wanted to use this as an excuse to make her suffer." When she couldn't take it, she took the initiative to mention it. Suddenly thinking of this, Wu Ling turned to ask his calm master curiously, "Since Lord wants to let her go, why didn't he take the initiative to ask her? Why did he have to go in such a big circle?" "She didn't say it. This king doesn't like to think too much," Xiao Su said indifferently. TSK, he doesn't like to think too much, but he forced people to this extent." Wu Ling shook his head in his heart. Master's group of people is really unique. It's a pity that Chu family's young miss didn't understand the meaning behind it and let go of an opportunity. "Let's not talk about this matter anymore." Turan's expression was solemn. "Master, His Majesty wants you to rest for a period of time. I'm afraid that he doesn't believe you and has already sent people to investigate you. Let him be." Xiao Su put the lid back on his cup, his eyes turning cold. Chapter 42. Chu Qingyan returned to her own courtyard after being struck by a bolt from the blue. After her mind calmed down, her back was covered in cold sweat. To be honest, she had taken a risk today. She wasn't someone who couldn't endure hardship, but in the King of England's manner, she couldn't clearly see the environment she was in. In the end, she didn't know how Xiao Su viewed her. So even if she had to risk pulling his whiskers in front of a tiger, she still had to take the risk to see if he would vent his anger on her because of this undesirable marriage. But it had to be said that the results of the test left her puzzled. From his attitude, she could feel that he seemed to treat her as a pet, a feeling that he would tease her when he felt like it. This feeling was very subtle, but she didn't feel any malice. On the contrary, the suggestion he had made today had been rejected by her on the spot. But now that she thought about it, if she had really brought it up at that time, would he have let her go and let her leave the manor? The answer, she didn't know. Chu Qingyan sighed softly. Since she was already here, she might as well make the best of it. Finally letting go of this matter, Chu Qingyan stretched her waist and suddenly felt that her stomach was empty. At this time, Xining walked in with a plate. Chu Qingyan smiled. It really was timely. But when she saw the things on the plate, she felt that her appetite had disappeared. Xining looked at her master's twitching mouth and couldn't help but lower her eyebrows. She said guiltily, "Master, when this servant went to the kitchen to get food, this was all there was. Stir-fried vegetables, skinless steamed buns, and porridge that was as thin as water." Chu Qingyan pressed her forehead and waved her hand, saying, "Leave it. For the poor people outside, this is already considered very good." This was the first meal she had eaten without eating with Xiao Su. She didn't expect that this was the treatment of a future Wangfei. But when she thought of how the white tiger had put her in her place when she entered the manor, she couldn't help but twitch the corner of her mouth. Forget it, people had to lower their heads under the eaves. She would accept this reasoning. But when she chewed on this tasteless steamed bun, Chu Qingyan couldn't help but miss the golden steamed bun that Huang Yi made. That chewy, that fragrant and soft, Chu Qingyan's saliva almost flowed out. At this time, Xining was watching her master eat from the side. She said with sadness and joy, "Fortunately, Lord only said that you don't have to eat breakfast together. Lunch and dinner can still be eaten in Yushuan courtyard. Then master doesn't have to eat these disgusting dishes." Chu Qingyan finally remembered what Xiao Su had said to her in Yushuan courtyard today. He had removed her from the morning companionship, but she had to be there for the rest of the meals. The reason was to let her adapt to this life as soon as possible. But Chu Qingyan couldn't understand. What was there to adapt to this life? But when she thought of the cold air around him, she immediately nodded in agreement. It was very necessary to adapt. What if one day she couldn't stand his low pressure and froze? Thinking of this, Chu Qingyan immediately rubbed the goosebumps on her arms. After the meal, there was nothing to do. Chu Qingyan let Xining talk about the affairs of the Wangfu. Xining had only entered the Wangfu for less than half a year. In addition, she was still young and didn't know much about the affairs of the Wangfu. So Chu Qingyan understood a few things from her childish words, such as 7-colored head maidservants. This was what Chu Qingyan called the 7-colored maidservants. For example, Hong Yi and Cheng Yi had followed Lord since they were young. The other 5 were arranged to follow him intermittently. For example, Huang Yi was a famous chef. Because her family declined, she was sold to the Wangfu. Because she made good dishes, she was chosen by the steward and arranged to enter Yushuan courtyard. At Xiao Su's side, there were also bodyguards, Gu Rong and Gu Yi. They were arranged by Empress Liang to follow and protect him 5 years ago. Xiao Su generally didn't care about the affairs of the Wangfu. The large and small matters of the front courtyard were basically decided by the steward, while the rear courtyard was managed by Hong Yi. Chu Qingyan thought that it seemed that Xiao Su still valued this head maidservant, Hong Yi. After coming here for a few days, she also felt that although Hong Yi was gentle and polite, she had a sense of balance in the way she handled things. Her words were reasonable and were very easy to convince. It had to be said that her ability was really quite good. At this time, Chu Qingyan thought that although Xiao Su didn't take a concubine, there were several head maidservants in the courtyard who were as beautiful as flowers and jade. She didn't know if Xiao Su could control himself, or if he had already indulged in the land of tenderness. Thinking of this, Chu Qingyan felt a bit disgusted. She came from the modern world and was educated to be monogamous. She completely couldn't tolerate the ancient world having groups of wives and concubines. She felt a bit of a headache. If in the future she saw Xiao Su hugging other women, how should she react? But with his entire body emitting an aura that kept people away, would any woman dare to approach him? Chu Qingyan shook her head. What did this have to do with her? She was only a little over 10 years old. No matter how much of a beast he was, it was impossible for him to have any ideas about her. Besides, there were still a few years until the marriageable age, so it was hard to say if there would be any changes during that time. Xining was young and couldn't hide her thoughts. She also happened to like this master, so early in the morning, she had been talking endlessly, racking her brains to tell her master everything she knew. Seeing that her master was listening with great interest, Xining rolled her eyes and remembered what she heard in the kitchen today. She immediately poured everything out. Master, this servant heard something today. It was related to Lord. What is it? Let's hear it. Chu Qingyan casually replied. When Xining heard this, she immediately lowered her voice and said, I heard from Xiao Kai in the kitchen that the reason Lord didn't go to court in the morning was because a minister in the court was found to be corrupt. Some people said that this minister was involved with Lord, so His Majesty had Lord stay in the palace to rest for the next few days. He probably wants to investigate this matter. When Chu Qingyan heard this, she couldn't help sitting up straight. Corruption and bribery, in the eyes of the monarch, was a thorn that would not be lightly dealt with. But how could Xiao Su be involved in this matter? That cold wolf-like figure appeared in front of her. No matter how she looked at it, it didn't look like he would collude with others. But one couldn't judge a book by its cover. What if it was true? Chu Qingyan was forced to break out in a cold sweat by this matter. If Xiao Su was really found to be tainted, then wouldn't she, the cheap princess consort, also be implicated? So, asking for leave to stay at home was a lie. Being investigated was the truth. At this time, Xining, who didn't know the severity of the matter, was still speaking. Lord isn't that kind of person. Although he is unreasonable, doesn't like to be close to people, and is strict and cold, this servant doesn't believe that Lord would rob the people of their wealth. Hearing Xining's words of loyalty to protect her master, Chu Qingyan wiped the cold sweat on her forehead and shook her head in her heart. In the officialdom, no one could say for sure what was true and what was false. It was also possible that it was easy to dodge a spear in the open but hard to defend against a stab in the dark. But in the end, she hadn't come into contact with the smokeless officialdom. She couldn't agree with Xining's words. At this time, Yushuan courtyard sent someone to summon her. Chu Qingyan looked at the sun. It was noon again. She was going to meet that big ice cube again. Chapter 43. When Chu Qingyan stepped into the courtyard of Yuxian Yuan, the ink-colored figure in the room entered her eyes. A light breeze entered the window, gently brushing against the white veil, giving people the illusion of an elegant mist. And in this light, he was leisurely leaning against the chair. His black hair was vertical, and his slightly narrowed eyes contained a sharp gaze. His thin lips were lightly pursed, and the silver mask covered the cold arrogance that was about to burst out. Alone, he exuded a domineering aura that looked down on the world. Chu Qingyan suddenly had an impulse. She wanted to lift that cold mask and see the face that was covered. But this thought only flashed through her mind for a moment before she quickly suppressed it. It wasn't that she didn't know about the rumors outside. His face had been disfigured by the fire. From Xining's advice, she knew that this was a taboo in the Wang Fu, and also Xiao Su's bottom line that could not be touched. In this moment of distraction, Chu Qingyan felt Xiao Su's seemingly indiscernible gaze. She hurriedly squeezed out an innocent smile, but the other side looked away in disdain. Chu Qingyan coughed and quickly sat down. It turned out that she had been staring at him for a long time. People who didn't know would think that she was infatuated. Chu Qingyan was a little annoyed. Just as she pulled out the chair and sat down, she heard the person beside her lazily say, "Do you have any headache or fever right now?" Chu Qingyan knew that he was being sarcastic about her actions a few days ago. She couldn't help but give an embarrassed smile. "Thanks to your highness' concern, Qingyan has already recovered." She only saw Xiao Su give a light laugh. It didn't sound happy or unhappy. Chu Qingyan was puzzled. This person really was unpredictable. The food was already on the table. Compared to her breakfast, it was like the difference between heaven and earth. Xiao Su glanced at Chu Qingyan's shining eyes. It was as if he was looking at a small dog drooling at the sight of a bone. A faint smile that he didn't notice flashed through his eyes. After loving, one would know the weight. After being drunk, one would know the strength of the wine. At this time, for Chu Qingyan, it was like eating before knowing the taste of the food. It was only one meal, but she already knew Huang Yi's cooking. In just a few days, her stomach had already been bought over by Huang Yi. Huang Yi was still waiting on the side. Seeing her so infatuated with the food she made, she was very happy. As a cook, the most important thing was that her food could be recognized, and ninth young Miss Chu was using her own body to affirm her cooking. Unlike the past few years, when her lord enjoyed her food, he had never shown such an expression. This always made her feel very lonely. How? Chu Qingyan didn't know that Huang Yi had already included her in her scope. She ate 3 small bowls of rice before stopping. Then, she glanced at the person in front of her with some regret. She didn't know if her big appetite scared him. What if he felt that she was wasting food? Would he deduct her food? Xiao Su saw her put down the bowl and chopsticks and looked at him with a cautious expression. He couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Then, he brushed his sleeves and stood up. "Let's go to the study." It was time to grind the ink again. This time, Chu Qingyan immediately stood up and followed him. She had something she wanted to ask him. After the two left, Huang Yi hummed a tune as she cleaned up the table. Cheng Yi walked in and looked at her. She curled her lips and said, "In a good mood?" Because she was in a good mood, Huang Yi didn't care about the mockery in her words. She nodded and said, "Every time I see Ninth Miss Chu eat the food I make, I feel a sense of satisfaction. And today, Lord ate an extra bowl of rice for the first time. He must have been influenced by Ninth Miss Chu. To me, this is something that gives me a sense of accomplishment." Cheng Yi said disapprovingly, "This little thing makes you so happy that you can't contain your joy. Aren't you too useless?" Huang Yi couldn't be bothered to argue with her. She said a few perfunctory words and took the bowl and chopsticks and left. After Huang Yi left, Cheng Yi looked in the direction of the study. Her eyes flashed with jealousy. How could this Chu Qingyan have the qualifications to eat at the same table as master? She was simply a toad wanting to eat swan meat. As long as she had the chance, she would definitely take care of this toad. The window blocked the sinister gaze from the main courtyard. The people inside didn't know that they were being targeted. Hong Yi, who was standing outside, saw the gaze in Cheng Yi's eyes. She was slightly surprised. After standing for a while, she turned and left. But a strange ripple appeared at the corner of her mouth. In the study, two figures stood as usual, one standing and the other standing. White and black, small and big, soft and hard, they reflected each other and were exceptionally harmonious. Chu Qingyan was grinding as she thought about how to ask about the rumors of corruption. She wanted to know if he was innocent, because this was related to her future life. She couldn't be blamed for the accident, but because in this world where the strong preyed on the weak, she couldn't protect herself at all. Moreover, as a woman, she was a man's accessory. If she made a mistake, she would die without a burial place. She had just come to this world and was reunited with her parents. She cherished this opportunity and didn't want anyone to take it away from her. So the more she cared, the more uneasy she felt. If you have something to say, just say it. Don't dawdle. Chu Qingyan was so frightened that her hand trembled and she almost spilled ink onto her white dress. When she steadied herself, she was a little embarrassed. She didn't think that her thoughts would be seen through so easily. As expected, she wasn't experienced enough. Actually, Chu Qingyan was wrong. It wasn't that she couldn't hide her emotions, but in front of someone who was deliberately observing her, even the slightest expression would be hard to escape. Moreover, the person in front of her was a marshal who controlled millions of lions. He observed her body language and was meticulous. It only took him a little effort to see through her thoughts. Chu Qingyan didn't think too much about it. She looked up at the person in front of her. After a short time together, she knew that he wasn't someone who liked to stammer, so she didn't beat around the bush. I heard that the Lord didn't go to the morning court because it was related to a corruption case. Is this true? Although she was being frank, she didn't forget her current status. She had a cute and innocent look on her face. Hearing this, Xiao Su looked up at her. His eyes were deep and unfathomable. Are you worried about this, prince, or? His tone was slightly mocking. Are you worried about whether or not you will be implicated? This was the first time she saw other emotions in Xiao Su's eyes other than indifference. It was cold and sharp. It was as if he could see into the depths of a person's soul and imprison it so that it couldn't move. Chu Qingyan felt as if she had been frozen by ice. She couldn't help but take a step back. Unfortunately, she forgot that there was a table behind her. She was caught off guard and tripped over the foot of the table. Then, she couldn't support herself and fell back. She waved her hands in fear, but she knew that she was in trouble. Because no one would catch her, especially the person in front of her who had been looking at her coldly. The moment she closed her eyes in resignation, she seemed to see a smear of ink enter her eyes. Chapter 44. Just when Chu Qingyan thought it was over, her eyes were quickly submerged by a touch of black. Then a force came from her waist, a warm touch with a hardness that couldn't be ignored. Then her feet spun and she crashed into a chest with a clear breath. If it wasn't for the strong heartbeat echoing in her ears, she would have mistakenly thought that she had fallen into a green field. Her nose was filled with the scent of nature. It was so clean and comfortable that people couldn't help but want to hug it. Just when Chu Qingyan was about to fall into this illusion, she heard the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground. She was suddenly awakened. She immediately opened her eyes. Her eyes were still filled with a thick black, but the golden embroidery pattern was magnified. She suddenly raised her head and coincidentally met with the slightly annoyed gaze above her. She then realized that she had been pulled by him, which was why she had been spared. Only, the two's current movements, Chu Qingyan's hand was grabbing his collar and her entire body was in his embrace. The small her was embedded in his embrace like this, as if it was natural. Only at this close did she realize that the eyes that were not covered by the mask were so charming. Looking at it sideways, the eyelashes that were covered were like curly love leaves, slender and thick. It made people's hearts itch and they really wanted to reach out and touch it. But just as she had this thought, she immediately stopped. This was because she felt that the person in front of her had been looking at her the entire time. And she was staring at him with all her might, which was a hindrance to her ladylike demeanor. Even standing properly would cause you to fall. Qingyan, you're not the ordinary kind of stupid. His teasing came from above her head. Chu Qingyan was slightly stunned. This was the first time he had called her by her name, so she was a bit not used to it. But thinking about it, she didn't think it was strange. She couldn't help but lower her head and obediently admit her mistake. I didn't notice. It won't happen again. The person in his arms was small and light, just like a well-behaved rabbit. However, he knew that sometimes she would turn into a little kitten that was baring its fangs and brandishing its claws, or even a little hedgehog that was difficult to deal with. But at this time, she lowered her head slightly, looking obedient and harmless, which made his heart soften, and he couldn't help but want to tease her. He reached out to pinch her tender little face, his tone indifferent as he said, "Just now, you asked about the corruption in the imperial court. If this prince said that this matter was definitely related, what would you do?" Chu Qingyan did not expect that Xiao Su, who seemed unapproachable, would pinch her face like a pet. She was stunned. Although she was a 10-year-old lowly, she had the heart of a 20-year-old girl, okay? Her anger from being teased surged, but just as she was about to explode, she met his clear and penetrating eyes. She was instantly discouraged. It seemed that the other party really treated her like a little doll. Her heart that had been attacked heard his words and all the hairs on her body stood on end. Could it be that this matter really was related to him? However, when she saw his nonchalant attitude, Chu Qingyan could not figure out what he was thinking. She thought about it carefully and put on a resolute expression, but she was actually speechless and crying inside. My mother told me that if I marry a chicken, I will follow the chicken, if I marry a dog, I will follow the dog. Since His Majesty has bestowed Qingyan to your highness, then Qingyan will share weal and woe with your highness, and follow you in life and death. Although the words chicken and dog in Chu Qingyan's words did not reach his ears, he was satisfied with the overall meaning. Although he knew that she did not mean what she said, he liked to see her conflicted expression. At least you're tactful. Xiao Su stroked her long hair as a reward. Chu Qingyan could not help wanting to jump off his legs. After all, men and women should not touch each other. But she did not have that burden. It was clear that he was angry just now. If she had not accidentally tripped, she would be waiting for his anger right now. Inadvertently noticing a faint blush on the little fellow's face, Xiao Su thought that she was afraid. He couldn't help sighing that this little fellow was really easy to tease. He had only said a few words and she was scared. Don't worry, no matter how bad this king is, I will not put my attention on these unorthodox things. Xiao Su normally did not like to explain, but right now he was thinking of comforting the little person in his arms, so he did not even think before blurting it out. But after he said it, he felt a bit of regret. Hearing this, Chu Qingyan couldn't help revealing a bright smile. I just knew that the Lord was not that kind of person. Her joy was written all over her face. This meant that she did not need to worry about Xiao Su losing power. As the future princess consort, where would she go? She also did not need to worry if her parents would be implicated because of this. It really made her happy. Perhaps it was because Chu Qingyan was relieved too quickly that Xiao Su was unhappy. His voice was cold as he said, "It's a pity that in court, you can't be cleared just because you're innocent. There are many people who frame others and take the blame for others. If it was done with malice, it would be hard to escape blame." His mocking words successfully made the smile on Chu Qingyan's face freeze. She slowly turned her head to look at him. From his eyes, she could see the cruelty of officialdom. She couldn't help asking, "Then will you be wrongly accused?" Perhaps it was the concern in her words that made Xiao Su's face soften. "You just said that this king was not that kind of person. Then in your eyes, what kind of person is this king?" Chu Qingyan felt that this person was really too much. They were clearly talking about one topic, but he was able to change the topic. But who told him to be the Lord? Qingyan feels that the Lord is a brave warrior. He is upright and can do anything. In Qingyan's heart, he is a great hero. This was her judgment from a little child's point of view. Xiao Su smiled as he pinched her nose. His voice had a clear smile and a domineering aura that did not allow people to look at him directly. "Since you say that this king is omnipotent, then how could I be easily schemed against? Unless this king is willing." Chu Qingyan's eyes couldn't help twitching. Wasn't this person a bit too arrogant? He was trying to trick a little child like her. She knew that adults like to boast of their omnipotence in front of little children in order to gain their admiration and envy. She never thought that this Xiao Su would also be like this, not being modest at all. But it wasn't until a long time later that she truly understood that what he said today wasn't a lie. Because she saw that he was willing, and her heart ached and she shed tears because of his willingness. After teasing her a bit more, Xiao Su finally let her go. Only then did she react. Chu Qingyan had been held in his arms the entire time, so her face was slightly red. She did not dare raise her head to look at him, but it was also at this time that she saw that the corner of his clothes had been splashed with a few drops of ink. She could not help but look over and saw the inkstone on the ground and the pool of ink. Only then did she realize that the sound she had heard before was the inkstone falling to the ground. This position was exactly where she had been standing. Fortunately, Xiao Su had pulled her up in time, otherwise with the heavy inkstone falling, her little feet would have been gone. After being shy, she felt a bit of gratitude towards him. It was a pity that a certain person said in an unreasonable manner, "You added too much water and the ink has melted." Chu Qingyan immediately gritted her teeth. This person was not worthy of gratitude at all. Chapter 45. When Lan Yi came in, she immediately saw the mess on the ground. She also saw the ink on her lord's clothes. Although her lord was wearing black clothes, it could not hide the dampness. She was slightly surprised, but she quickly calmed down and began to clean up. Chu Qingyan smiled at her with a bit of embarrassment. Lan Yi returned her smile and then continued to clean up the ground. Chu Qingyan couldn't help but sigh. This girl really was like what the book said about beauty that made people unable to look away. Just as Chu Qingyan was being smitten, Xiao Su's voice sounded. "Come here." Chu Qingyan heard this and looked away from Lan Yi's body. She obediently walked in front of him. Right now, he was sitting and she was standing, so they were at eye level. "Why is Lord calling for Qingyan?" she asked curiously. "From today onwards, this king will teach you how to read." As soon as Xiao Su's words fell, he successfully saw her expression change. He found it funny inside. Why? Because she was too shocked, Chu Qingyan didn't even think about it before blurting it out. The result of saying this without thinking was that it successfully made Xiao Su's tone turn cold. "If this king's princess can't read a single word, do you think you'll be the only one losing face? You look like you have a deep grudge. Do you think this king doesn't know how to teach you?" Chu Qingyan was deeply frozen by these cold words. She couldn't even shake her head. She quickly denied it. No, 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 Qing Yan doesn't dislike it. It's just that I'm too shocked and can't react. Humph. Go pick a brush. Xiao Su was already too lazy to look at her inconsistent appearance. He casually pointed at her and let her go to the brush rack to choose. Chu Qingyan gave a soft sigh in her heart. She didn't know what this highness was thinking, always changing his mind. She wanted to learn how to write, but if the person in front of her was changed to this person, she felt that she would be afraid. However, she still accepted her fate and went to pick a brush. At this time, Xiao Su let her pick a brush as he went into the room to change his clothes. He could not tolerate any stains on his clothes. Without the oppressive atmosphere in the room, Chu Qingyan felt the pressure decrease. She slowly picked a brush. On the table, there were all kinds of brushes hanging from the rack. They were all different lengths, thicknesses, and textures. Some were made of bamboo, some were jadeite, and some were jade. They were all sparkling and dazzling. Under the light, they had a faint glow. Chu Qingyan took out a brush made of white jade. It was cool and comfortable to the touch. Chu Qingyan weighed it in her hand and found that it was very light. She had thought that a jade brush would be heavier than a bamboo brush, but it was actually very light. That meant that writing with it would be very comfortable. Ben Wang asked you to choose the brush, not to weigh the money. The unhurried voice penetrated the air and reached her ears, causing her to subconsciously withdraw her fingers. However, the pen made of white jade was too slippery, and it slipped through the gaps between her fingers. Crack! It fell to the ground and broke into two pieces. Chu Qingyan looked at the dismembered brush on the ground and was stunned. Xiao Su slightly raised his brows when he saw this. He stepped over the dismembered brush and sat down in the armchair. Behind him was Hong Yi. When Hong Yi came in, she also saw this scene. Her brows jumped. That was the Lord's favorite brush, but it was broken just like that. Thinking about it, this young miss from the Chu family would be reprimanded by her lord. It was always right to admit one's mistake the moment one did something wrong. So Chu Qingyan immediately lowered her head and admitted her mistake. Sorry, I didn't do it on purpose. If you want to blame someone, you have to take half the responsibility. Who told you to suddenly speak and scare me? Xiao Su did not look at the brush on the ground. He turned to look at her and said, Didn't this king tell you to pick a brush? What are you in a daze for? Could it be that you want to use your hand to replace the brush? Was he going to let it go just like that? Chu Qingyan foolishly turned around and continued to pick a brush. Her brain still hadn't processed what was going on. It wasn't just Chu Qingyan. Even Hong Yi, who was putting down the pastries, couldn't help but be stunned. She never thought that her lord would let her off just like that. She felt that it was a bit inconceivable. You can leave. Xiao Su said indifferently. Hong Yi naturally knew that when Lord was in his study, he didn't like anyone else to attend to him. Even Lan Yi was rarely in his room. He would only summon her in when he had something to do. At this time, Hong Yi glanced at the petite figure with her back to her as she picked a brush. It seemed like Lord really liked having this little girl by his side to serve him. Lan Yi entered the room and nodded at Hong Yi as she passed by. When she saw the broken brush on the ground, she was speechless again. She turned to look at Chu Qingyan, who was obediently picking a brush. She was surprised. This young miss of the Chu clan seemed to really like throwing things on the ground for fun. However, this was also a child's nature. Lan Yi had just picked up a brush when she heard Lord's impatient voice. I told you to pick a brush, not to pick vegetables in the market. What can you do if you dilly-dally? Lan Yi smiled slightly. It was clear that Lord cared about this young miss of the Chu clan. When Chu Qingyan heard this, she felt that she had been wronged. There were at least 10 brushes in front of her. She was dazzled by the number of brushes in front of her and didn't know where to start. At this time, she could only randomly pick one and turn to hand it to Xiao Su. Xiao Su raised his brows at her choice. Are you sure? Chu Qingyan looked at the brush in her hand. It was comfortable to hold, and the bristles of the brush were round and conical. It was neither flat nor thin, and there were decorative patterns on it. It looked beautiful, light, and beautiful. Of course, she was sure. However, she believed that Xiao Su's words had a hidden meaning. It didn't seem like he had said it casually. However, she really couldn't find a reason to say that this brush wasn't good. Seeing her nod in confusion, Xiao Su didn't say anything else. He took her brush and then explained the posture of holding the brush. The posture of holding the brush is just these few words. Pen, mark, hook, square, block. As he spoke, he held the brush and demonstrated. Actually, she had learned how to use a brush for a year in the modern world. However, she had neglected it for too long, so she was rusty. Moreover, she was just a child who grew up in a poor village. How could she possibly know how to read? So when Xiao Su asked her if she could read, she shook her head. However, when she saw Xiao Su holding the brush, she was reminded of her teacher. It couldn't be compared at all. She had to admit that the cold Xiao Su's posture of holding the brush was very good. It was even more accurate than her teacher's. The first section of the thumb was pressed against the inside of the brush. The joint of the thumb twisted the brush slightly outwards. Using the first joint of the index finger to press against the outside of the brush, and cooperating with the thumb, he grabbed the brush. Using the first and second sections of the middle finger to hook the outside of the brush like a hook. Using the nail of the ring finger to push against the outside of the right side of the brush, he blocked the hook of the middle finger and pushed it outwards. The little finger was pressed against the ring finger, resting under the ring finger and not touching the brush. The ring finger was weak, so it couldn't push the hook of the middle finger alone. It needed the little finger to support it and add more strength. This was what her teacher had told her. At that time, this simple action, when Xiao Su did it, had a kind of impulse to focus on it. After speaking, Xiao Su threw the brush back to her. Hold the brush. Chapter 46. With her previous foundation, Chu Qingyan didn't find it difficult, but the iceberg teacher reprimanded her. Firm fingers, empty palms, vertical palms, flat wrists, straight pipes. Chu Qingyan blushed with shame. What a strict teacher. The fingers must be strong when holding the brush. The joints must be pointed outwards, and the fingers must be firm but not loose. The 5 fingers must be firm and strong, and it will help you move the brush. However, the tightness must be moderate. If it's too tight, it won't work well. If it's too loose, it won't work well. Chu Qingyan subconsciously increased her strength. Pa! The ruler fell on the back of her hand, instantly leaving a red mark. She felt a burning pain and couldn't help but raise her teary eyes to glare at the culprit. Xiao Su ignored her glare and continued, "Don't shake your fingers. Concentrate." Chu Qingyan gritted her teeth. Compared to the iceberg teacher, she felt that the previous teacher was simply too gentle and kind. The iceberg teacher looked at her hand and continued, "Open the web between your thumb and index finger." Chu Qingyan heard this and slightly opened 2 fingers. Unfortunately, the teacher seemed to be somewhat dissatisfied. After a long time, she still couldn't meet his requirements. He slightly frowned. Chu Qingyan thought that he had given up, but she didn't expect to see him call Lan Yi in. "Bring in a raw egg." Lan Yi looked at Chu Qingyan doubtfully and immediately nodded. Chu Qingyan thought that Xiao Su was hungry and wanted to have a snack. However, on second thought, it wasn't a cooked egg. After Lan Yi served the egg, Xiao Su turned to let her hold it. She had a bad premonition. "Sure enough, wrap the egg in your palm and hold the brush well. If the egg falls, then you can forget about dinner." The iceberg teacher sat on the chair with a leisurely expression, but the words he said made people feel like they were asking for a beating. The cold egg in her hand made Chu Qingyan feel cold all of a sudden. Was this Xiao Su uncomfortable if he didn't torture her? Chu Qingyan had a belly full of anger that she couldn't vent. But after she calmed down, she had to admit that this method was indeed very effective. She could train her pen-holding posture, but her hands would easily get sore, okay? If you want to use all your strength, you must flatten your opponent's wrist and raise his blade. Don't keep your wrist leaning on the table. Pa! The ferrule fell once again. His fingers didn't hold it tightly, and the egg slipped out of his palm and landed on the table. It bloomed. The golden yellow egg yolk and the transparent viscous liquid instantly spread out on the table. It was like the scorching sun on the horizon, causing one to feel tender affection for it. But at this moment, Chu Qingyan was already stunned, because she realized that she had no fate with tonight's meal. What a pity. An indifferent voice sounded in her ears. It was like he was feeling pity for the egg, but it also sounded like he was feeling pity for her. But in Chu Qingyan's ears, it sounded like it was filled with ridicule. Chu Qingyan looked at the red marks on the back of her hand. She had practiced for 2 hours without rest, so she was now thirsty, tired, and hungry. She suddenly felt indignant from the bottom of her heart. She turned her head and looked at the person in front of her with an aggrieved expression. She angrily said, "Why do you always force me to do things I don't like? Unless you can give a reason to convince this king, then this king will not force you to learn to read." Xiao Su didn't seem to be angered by her words. He still leaned back in his chair and coldly looked at her. Chu Qingyan's eyes lit up. This person was trying to reason with her. She rolled her eyes and then came up with a reason that she felt was watertight. As the saying goes, a woman's virtue is if she has no talent. Kai doesn't need to be very knowledgeable, as long as she knows how to help Lord manage his palace, that's enough. When she finished speaking, she heard a low sneer. This king has never kept useless people by his side. Chu Qingyan was frightened by his tone. It was like a cold wind brushing past her ears, filled with arrogance, indifference, and ridicule. She couldn't help looking at the person in front of her. At this time, Xiao Su slowly looked away. His cold gaze had a trace of indifference as his thin lips slowly opened. "Qingyan, do you think that this king will lack someone to manage his palace? Moreover, she doesn't know anything." These words successfully made Chu Qingyan think of Bai Hu, who was in charge of the front yard, and Hong Yi, who was in charge of the backyard. She couldn't help feeling a bit ashamed. Indeed, he already had these capable left and right hands, why would he need someone? But she was clearly just being polite, all right? She just wanted him to give her a way out, but this person wasn't reasonable at all. Perhaps it was because his tone was too strong, but the person in front of him turned pale, as if she was frightened by him. Xiao Su couldn't help feeling a headache coming on. He was used to giving orders and was used to dealing with strong men. The people around him were also used to his way of doing things, but the person in front of him was different from his ministers, subordinates, and servants. He couldn't use force, but he didn't know how to use force, so he had never felt this defeated before. It seemed like he really didn't have the talent to educate children. He had clearly restrained his strength, but he didn't know if it was because the ruler was too hard or because her skin was too soft. The back of her hand was already slightly red. Xiao Su was also speechless. So the two of them looked at each other without saying anything. In the end, Chu Qingyan shook her sore arm, and then silently picked up the brush again. Chapter 47. When she returned home at night, she didn't even have the strength to take a bath and change her clothes. Chu Qingyan blinked her teary eyes. Why were her experiences during this period of time completely different from what she had imagined? Wasn't Xiao Su a cold, indifferent, and cold-blooded lord? Shouldn't he be high and mighty and keep people at arm's length? Shouldn't he be dismissive of her and throw her to the side without paying attention to her? Why was she ordered around and abused as soon as she entered the prince's mansion? Oh, Chu Qingyan looked up to the sky and howled. Why was all of this so strange that she was at a loss for what to do? At this time, Xining, who was wringing the towel while looking at her with a smile, had a joyful look on her face. Master, this servant realized that Lord treats you very well. He simply treats you differently. This servant has been in the prince's mansion for more than half a year, but this servant has never seen Lord take care of anyone like this. Xining, it's not terrible to be uncultured, but it's not good to use idioms indiscriminately. Which eye of yours saw that the King of England treats me differently? Chu Qingyan wanted to roll her eyes. Xining had an innocent look on her face. This servant saw it with both eyes. Besides, this servant is illiterate, so of course I'm uncultured. How can I be as fortunate as Master, who even has Lord personally as your teacher? Chu Qingyan raised her hand and tapped the little girl's forehead, curling her lips into a teasing smile. Am I not very dignified as your master? You actually dare to rebuke me? Xining smiled and waved her hand. How would this servant dare? Master, you're the most important and the person this servant admires the most. If you point to the east, this servant definitely doesn't dare to go the west. Chu Qingyan shook her head helplessly. After this girl followed her, she simply became more and more lively. Meanwhile, in Yushuan courtyard. Lord, I heard that this ninth young miss of the Chu family knocked over an inkstone today and broke your favorite jade brush. She's too unruly. Cheng Yi held the clothes and placed them in the wardrobe. She turned and walked to Xiao Su's side, her tone indignant. A haze flashed through her eyes. In the past few days, Lord had actually been so attentive to Chu Qingyan, which made Cheng Yi feel uncomfortable. This was the first time that she saw the Lord willing to let a woman get close to him. Although she was just a brat, she was still the Lord's wife in name. With the Lord's side, these past few years. Xiao Su, who was resting with his eyes closed, was indifferent to her words. Has the Wang Fu reached the point where they can't even afford a brush? Cheng Yi did not think that Lord would actually reply to her like this. Could it be that Chu Qingyan already had a certain position in Lord's heart? Cheng Yi misspoke. She lowered her head in fear. Although Lord's tone was calm, the pressure he had accumulated over the past few days still made her tremble in fear. Lord disliked people talking nonsense the most. She had accidentally blurted it out today, so she immediately regretted it. You can leave. Xiao Su continued to close his eyes to rest. Cheng Yi did not know if Lord was displeased by her words, so she retreated in fear. When she walked out of the room, her expression turned to anger. Chu Qingyan, this brat. If she had the chance, she would definitely not let her have an easy time. After Cheng Yi left, Hualing and Turan walked in. Seeing that their lord's expression was normal and that he was not affected by the bustling corruption case outside, they couldn't help but feel relaxed. What is it? Xiao Su slightly opened his eyes, his expression lazy and cold. Hualing put away his smile and sternly said, Lord, Wang Chang's family has already been searched, but His Majesty has not yet issued a decree to convict them. His Majesty probably wants to find evidence of Lord's involvement through Wang Chong, but this has nothing to do with Lord. He probably won't be able to find anything. Turan coldly sneered. Xiao Su indifferently raised his brow and propped up his chin with his hand. Seeing that Lord didn't seem to care, Hualing and Turan glanced at each other. Turan worriedly said, Lord, the person in charge of this case is Lin Fengzheng. If he plays any tricks, His Majesty will be even more suspicious of you. Lin Fengzheng was the disciple of Right Minister Fu Jianrong, and Fu Jianrong was Consort Yu's father. Xiao Su indifferently said. Don't act rashly. Perhaps he's waiting for us to panic. The fire spirit and earth spirit felt that their liege's words were very reasonable, but a hint of bitterness appeared on their lips. Their liege had been perfectly fine, but because someone had submitted a memorial accusing their liege of colluding with Wang Chong, His Majesty had ordered their liege to return to his residence and recuperate. His Majesty had said that his liege had been given a special leave to rest because of his great achievements in the conquests of the north and south. Anyone with a discerning eye could see that their liege had been suspected by his Majesty, which was why his authority had been taken away. Seeing that Lord wasn't very interested in this matter, Hualing changed the topic. Lord, I heard that the young lady of the Chu clan caused trouble in the courtyard. As soon as his voice fell, he received a faint glance from his master. Hualing quivered and couldn't help but smile apologetically. Wang Ye, what are you looking at? It's only been a few days and your ears have grown. Thinking about it, he could tell that Lord was teasing him. Hualing chuckled. As a subordinate, I naturally have to pay attention to my master's every move. Isn't that right, Atu? Turan was very indifferent to Hualing's winking. He turned to his master and hesitantly asked, Master, you seem to treat the ninth young lady of the Chu clan differently. Do you have some plans? Plans? Xiao Su fell into deep thought, and a cute little face appeared in front of him. He didn't seem to have any plans for her and was just following his heart. Seeing that his master didn't answer, Turan pursed his lips and couldn't help but call out, Lord? Xiao Su withdrew his thoughts. I have nothing to do, so I'm just looking for something to do. Hualing couldn't help but laugh. So Lord was just teasing little girls when he had nothing to do. He couldn't help but sympathize with Chu Qingyan. Turan didn't say anything else, but his impression of Chu Qingyan became even worse. He subconsciously felt that the people that his Majesty gave to his master weren't good people, so his dissatisfaction with her always existed. The next day, Chu Qingyan came to report again. Because she had to learn how to write, Chu Qingyan deliberately rolled up her sleeves and tied a small knot around each of her wrists to make it easier for her to move. Xiao Su looked at her nondescript actions and didn't say a word. He turned around and picked up a brush, slowly sketching on the prepared rice paper. This was the first time she saw Xiao Su write. His black robe was untidy, and his body was tall and slender. His slender fingers poked out of his sleeves to hold the brush. The mask covered his face, so she couldn't see his expression. But from his deep eyes and the way he bent over, she could see that he was calm and relaxed, as well as casual and lazy. His drooping sleeves brushed across the table with the movement of his wrist, as if brushing against her heart, making it itchy. She carefully observed it. It wasn't because he wrote slowly, but because in the quiet study, the air seemed to be stagnant, so his every move seemed to be played in slow motion. It made her a little infatuated. He had never felt that there was someone who could write so beautifully like a painting. When Xiao Su put down the brush, Chu Qingyan finally came back to her senses. She couldn't help but move over to look at the words he wrote. Chapter 48. Chu Qingyan. That was her name. She was slightly taken aback. This character was elegant and reserved, and the scent of ink was slightly intoxicating. It gave people a comfortable and clear feeling. She never knew that such simple words could be written with such an open mind. Xiao Su did not know the admiration in her heart. He stretched out his hand and pointed at the paper. He slowly said, Your name. Chu Qingyan subconsciously nodded. To learn how to read, we will start with your name. In this hour, you will first practice these 3 characters. Xiao Su moved slightly to the side to make room for her. Chu Qingyan nodded again. She held the brush and dipped it in ink. Around the belly of the brush was full and round, and the ink was so thick that it could not dissolve. She had not written with a brush for many years. She did not have confidence in her heart. Her fingers trembled slightly, and a drop of thick ink dripped onto the snow-white paper and spread. Chu Qingyan subconsciously looked at Xiao Su, who was watching her. Seeing that he did not have any expression, she heaved a sigh of relief. She immediately collected the ink on the inkstone. She had been too anxious just now and had stained it with too much ink. Chu Qingyan only bent down to write after gathering her breath and calming herself down. Every stroke was a little stiff, and there were thin forks everywhere. Chu Qingyan blushed with shame. She had not written for many years, and her writing was indeed not presentable. Fortunately, Xiaosu did not say anything and allowed her to practice. Chu Qingyan lowered her head to write again. After she had filled 2 pieces of paper, she planned to continue switching fingers. She had just covered a new piece of paper when the golden sunlight under her sleeve suddenly covered a black shadow. Chu Qingyan focused her eyes and saw that it was actually a figure. She was just about to turn around when she saw that the black shadow had completely surrounded her. A cold and fragrant smell of ink instantly hit her in the face. Chu Qingyan immediately froze on the spot. She lowered her head and watched as a slender white hand passed through her waist and grasped the hand that was holding the brush. Then the other hand was casually placed on the table to her left. Chu Qingyan originally thought that a person with such a cold temperament who emitted a cold aura would have hands like 1,000-year-old ice. But when his hand covered hers, she only felt warmth, like the warm spring sun. She was slightly stunned. No, how could she be bewitched by beauty? Although she was obsessed with looks, she still had integrity, okay? She should be angry because she was being taken advantage of right now, shouldn't she? Because Chu Qingyan's back was facing Xiaosu, he did not see Chu Qingyan's wonderful mood changes. When his hand wrapped around her small hand, Xiaosu was also stunned for a long time. This was the first time he had held someone's hand. In his 20 years of life, what he had done the most was holding a brush and a sword. They were all cold and silent, but this touch of softness in his hand made him feel a novelty. Her hand was very small, so small that his hand could wrap around it. It was fleshy and her joints were thin and short. It was as if with a gentle grip, he could crush her in his hand. She was very thin and weak, but also very pitiful. Xiaosu's fingers moved slightly, bringing her hand along to spin the brush on the white paper. Chu Qingyan was quickly attracted by his actions. She knew that he wanted to teach her how to write. Her teacher had done this before and it was a very common thing, but for some reason, when Xiaosu's back covered her body, she felt a little uncomfortable. Focus. A cold voice sounded from beside her, with a trace of displeasure. Chu Qingyan shivered as she could clearly feel the impatience in his voice. Chu Qingyan immediately focused her attention on the paper in front of her. Perhaps she was overthinking it. Xiaosu might only be treating her as a student and she was being too sensitive. With this thought, her entire body relaxed and she no longer let her imagination run wild. Feeling the stiff person below him slowly relax, Xiaosu raised his brows. The words you wrote just now were too ugly. If you take it out, it will tarnish this king's reputation. Hearing this, Chu Qingyan secretly stuck out her tongue. Although her writing was ugly, in the eyes of beginners, it was already pretty good, alright? However, she did not forget that the person behind her was a person who pursued perfection. Moreover, as a person in power, he was proud and arrogant. He never cared about the process and only cared about the results, so it was normal that her writing did not enter his eyes. But to be honest, under his guidance, her writing did look a lot better. If it wasn't for her hand being too stiff, the words she wrote would be a bit more elegant than before. After writing a few words with her hand, Xiaosu let go and let her practice on her own. Pay attention to the feeling just now. Move your wrist without moving your arm. When writing horizontally, it should be thick at both ends and thin in the middle. When writing vertically, your fingers should not tremble. Do you think you are drawing a caterpillar? Xiaosu's gentle reprimand had a teasing tone that even he did not notice. His eyes opened and there was a faint smile in his eyes. Chu Qingyan naturally did not see it. She only felt that this person's requirements were too high. If it was in this world, she was only a beginner. Xiaosu actually had such high requirements for her. Lord, more haste, less speed. Qingyan has only just started learning, so she needs some time to relax. When Xiaosu finished saying that he would teach her the other words later, Chu Qingyan could not take it anymore and immediately raised her head to refute. Xiao Su did not get angry when he heard this. Instead, he looked at her indifferently, more haste, less speed. You actually know the meaning of this word. That's a good choice. However, have you ever heard of a strict teacher producing a brilliant student? This king is not a very patient person. As long as I am your teacher, I can only obey. Tyrannical. Chu Qingyan muttered when she heard this. How could these soft words escape Xiao Su's ears? Xiao Su slightly hooked his lips. Write 20 pieces of paper today. Otherwise, you'll have to think of something for dinner yourself. Dinner again. Chu Qingyan was depressed. Did she look like someone who only wanted to eat all day? But she seemed to be a little hungry. Chu Qingyan looked at the table. There were still a dozen or so pieces of paper to reach 20 pieces. This was too much of a scam. After successfully seeing Chu Qingyan's deflated expression, Xiao Su was in a good mood. He leaned over and grabbed her hand, helping her write his name stroke by stroke. The reason was that it didn't matter if she didn't know anyone's name, but she couldn't not write his name. Didn't they say that he was tyrannical? Then he would explain it even more vividly. Then he let her practice on her own. Chu Qingyan found it funny. Although she was depressed, she had to admit that Xiao Su's handwriting was really good. He was worthy of being a teacher. However, to be his disciple, one's mental strength had to be very strong. With Xiao Su's guidance from time to time, Chu Qingyan learned quickly. Xiao Su was quite satisfied and asked, "What character do you want to learn?" Chu Qingyan tilted her head and thought carefully. Then she said, "What character does Lord want to teach me?" This inquiring tone made Xiao Su faintly happy. He smiled, but did not say anything. Instead, he used his actions to write down those few words. Chu Qingyan originally thought that this was considered flattery, but when she saw those few words, she couldn't help but twitch her mouth. Chapter 49. Master, Xiao Zhuozi has successfully convinced the fourth prince. He will go to the King of England's residence in a few days. A person dressed like a eunuch reported to the person in front of him while kneeling on the ground. You did well. Are the other things ready? A low female voice faintly sounded. In the empty room, it seemed especially gloomy and scary. Master, don't worry. Everything is going according to plan. Then, this consort will wait for your good news. As you command. The phoenix outlined by golden threads was auspicious. Under the dim palace lamp, a layer of faint light appeared. As the days passed, Chu Qingyan gradually got used to Xiao Su's mood, which was unpredictable and liked to tease her, although this was her one-sided opinion. Apart from that day when Xiao Su wrote stupid words on the paper, Chu Qingyan's simple life was quite comfortable. The premise was that she was willing to be literate. However, in Chu Qingyan's view, Xiao Su could barely be considered a good teacher. Her dog-like handwriting was already pleasing to the eye. If there was something that was not to her liking, it would be the increasingly impatient and contemptuous expressions of Xiao Su's supporters, especially Cheng Yi. However, Chu Qingyan, who pretended to be cute everywhere, still captured the motherly hearts of several head maidservants of Yushuan courtyard, such as Huang Yi and Lu Yi. On this day, Chu Qingyan was still practicing calligraphy alone in the study room. Occasionally, when Xiao Su saw that her posture was not right, or that her handwriting was not good, he would come forward and teach her hand by hand, just like the first time. Chu Qingyan had gradually gotten used to the touch of his skin. She also got over it. Xiao Su only treated her as a half-grown child. As long as she was calm, she would not feel that something was wrong. After Chu Qingyan wrote 2 large characters, a subordinate entered the study room. Then, Xiao Su went out and told her to write well. Chu Qingyan agreed. If it was in the past, she would have been lazy. However, after coming to the ancient times, she knew the importance of mastering a skill. However, she did not have the golden finger in the novel. The female lead's medical skills were excellent, or her martial arts were excellent, or she was full of farming knowledge. She only had the heart of a rice worm. Now, she also wanted to learn to write well. At the very least, her calligraphy was the district's second prize, okay? However, Xiao Su's requirements were too high. To him, her handwriting was just crooked dog-like handwriting. She must not be looked down upon by him. Therefore, Chu Qingyan continued to write a few more large characters. When she put down the brush and stood up while rubbing her right wrist, a pair of large black eyes suddenly appeared in front of her. Chu Qingyan was so scared that she backed up a few steps. Only when she hit the window behind her did she stop. She looked up and saw the youth who had suddenly appeared without a sound. He was born as white as jade and cute with red lips and white teeth. His eyelashes were long and curly, and his face was so soft that it looked like water would come out of it with a pinch. He looked very delicate, just like a little Shota. However, his phoenix-like eyes were slightly narrowed, revealing an arrogant and condescending look. "Who are you?" Chu Qingyan rubbed her chest as she spoke with a bit of displeasure. Although the youth in front of her was as beautiful as a flower, she did not miss the disdain and hostility in his eyes. "You don't have the qualifications to know who this prince is." His tone was light as he slightly raised his head and looked at her with disdain. He really was a little brat. Although he was a head taller than her and looked older than her, his actions were very childish. A single sentence had already revealed his identity. It looked like he was Xiao Su's brother, the prince of the Sichuan kingdom. But Chu Qingyan was not very interested in the imperial family. She only knew that there was the Sichuan retired emperor who wanted her to marry into the King of England's palace, the Sichuan emperor who added fuel to the fire, Empress Liang who didn't really like her, and Xiao Su. She did not have the heart to understand the others. "Qingyan greets your highness." A wise person submits to circumstances. She could clearly see that the other person was impatient with her, so there was no need to force it. Chu Qingyan did not want to slap a smiling face. This was what Chu Qingyan was thinking. Xiao Ran did not think that his identity would be seen through so quickly, but he was not angry. He turned to Chu Qingyan who was slightly bowing to him. This stinky girl's appearance was very average. She was so short and rude. How could she be the princess consort of his eldest brother? Xiao Ran had a belly full of anger just thinking about it. "Stinky girl, what qualifications do you have to be the princess consort of the King of England? You're not even fit to carry my royal brother's shoes." In the palace, he had heard the palace maid's evaluation of Chu Qingyan. It was nothing more than vulgar and her status was low. At this time, he also looked at the girl in front of him with this kind of desire. Chu Qingyan pulled the corners of her mouth. She did not know how she had offended this prince. The moment he came, he spoke in an unfriendly tone to defend Xiao Su. However, this person was not the emperor who was not anxious, but the eunuch was anxious. Xiao Su did not say anything, so he was being too meddlesome. "Reporting to your highness, Qingyan is not a stinky girl. Whether or not I am the princess consort of the King of England is not something that I, Qingyan, can decide. As for carrying His Royal Highness's shoes, there will be someone else who will take responsibility. Your Highness does not need to worry. Also, Qingyan is very curious. Does your Highness live by the sea?" Xiao Su was originally very angry. When he heard her last question, he was slightly stunned and had a puzzled expression. "What do you mean? You're really meddlesome." Chu Qingyan continued unhurriedly. Xiao Ran was so angry that he stomped his feet. This was the first time that he had been ridiculed and rebutted. He was somewhat flustered and exasperated as he said, "Stinky girl, you actually dare to talk back to this prince with your glib tongue. Someone, slap this prince." As soon as his voice fell, two feminine men immediately appeared behind him. At a glance, it was obvious that they were eunuchs. Chu Qingyan did not expect that he would put on a show of full force as soon as he came up. She was stunned for a moment before she was suppressed. Your Highness, although you are the son of the dragon, you can't privately punish me. Moreover, I am still your royal sister-in-law in name. Chu Qingyan straightened her chest and ignored the fear in her heart as she spoke unhurriedly. In her heart, she was wondering where the big ice cube had run off to. Why was there not a single person in the huge Yushuan courtyard? Royal sister-in-law. Xiao Ran felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He had accepted this little girl who was 2 years younger than him as his royal sister-in-law. Moreover, she was the princess consort of his royal brother whom he respected the most. This was simply unacceptable to him. How could this stinky girl in front of him be worthy of his wise and mighty royal brother? Xiao Ran had a bellyful of indignation. It was fine that his royal father and royal grandfather were fooling around, but he had to properly teach this stinky girl who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth a lesson. Otherwise, it would not be enough to appease his anger. Give this prince a heavy slap. After causing such a big commotion, there was actually not a single person. Chu Qingyan gradually understood in her heart, and a trace of sadness flashed through her heart. She did not do anything wrong, but it was precisely because the status of the person in front of her was noble and unattainable that the power of life and death was grasped in front of him. This was the power of the ancient times. The upper class was high and mighty, while the common people were as lowly as ants. This kind of feeling was really uncomfortable. Chu Qingyan slightly hooked her lips, revealing a trace of self-mockery. She slowly closed her eyes, waiting for that slap to fall. Chapter 50. Chu Qingyan closed her eyes and waited for a long time, but that slap did not fall. While she was filled with doubt, she heard the sound of the eunuch beside her taking a deep breath. Royal brother. Xiao Ran's voice was filled with surprise. Chu Qingyan immediately opened her eyes and met those eyes that were like obsidian. Her heart had never been like this before, as a wave of grievance and sadness filled her heart. Fourth royal brother, you came to my king's palace just to hit my people? Xiao Su's eyes casually swept over the 2 eunuchs holding on to Chu Qingyan. The 2 of them were scared by his ice-cold eyes and unconsciously let go of Chu Qingyan. The eunuch that was caught by Hualing held onto his wrist and quickly returned behind Xiao Ran. Chu Qingyan felt that he must have not been gentle, otherwise that white and clean face would not have become even more pale. Chu Qingyan couldn't help walking to Xiao Su's side. She slightly lowered her head and her eyes were filled with tears. She looked like a little wife, but she did not say anything. These 2 were brothers, but that did not mean that Xiao Su stopping Xiao Ran from hitting her meant that he would help her vent her anger. Perhaps it was because of his face. If his fiancé was hit, he would not have any face left. So she tactfully stood to the side. If she didn't have so many scruples, she would not have suffered this loss. However, this person was still a child, so she was too embarrassed to argue with others. However, Chu Qingyan subconsciously hoped that Xiao Su would help her vent her anger, but when she realized this, she was a bit surprised. Based on what could Xiao Su blame his brother for her? She really was overestimating herself. Royal brother, you don't know. This ignorant commoner actually dared to talk back to me. She is simply not putting me in her eyes. I was just teaching her a lesson. When Xiao Ran heard his royal brother speak, he knew that he wanted to protect this stinky girl. He couldn't help feeling angry in his heart. This was the first time he heard his royal brother blame him for an outsider. What kind of demeanor is there to argue with a girl? Besides, as long as she puts this prince in her eyes, that's enough. Xiao Su sat down on the chair. His eyes were indifferent, but they made people feel an invisible pressure. When Xiao Ran heard this, he felt that it was hard to refute his imperial brother's words, but he also felt uncomfortable in his heart. Could it be that his imperial brother didn't want him as his imperial brother after having this stinky girl? Imperial brother, what's so good about this stinky girl? Not only is she ugly, but she also has a bad temper and no manners. She's not worthy of your protection. Xiao Ran glared at the well-behaved Chu Qingyan. In the face of Xiao Ran's childish behavior, the two adults opposite him were very calm. Xiao Su's expression did not change, but Chu Qingyan just rolled her eyes at him. Fourth Imperial Brother, could it be that you have an objection to Imperial Father's Imperial Edict? Xiao Su said without any fluctuation in his emotions. Xiao Ran choked. If his words just now were to reach his Imperial Mother's ears, he might be scolded. When Huoling, who was standing on the side, saw this, he interjected, Your Highness Fourth Prince, I heard that Her Highness Consort Yu is quite supportive of the marriage between my lord and Miss Chu. She even tried her best to matchmake them. Huoling's words were joking, but they contained a hint of sarcasm. This made Xiao Ran's face turn pale. He remembered the day the Imperial Edict was announced and the smile on his Imperial Mother's face. He suddenly felt that he did not have the qualifications to stand here and argue with his Imperial brother. Xiao Su looked at Huoling and Huoling immediately shut his mouth and lowered his head. When this prince came over just now, I saw that your Imperial Mother sent someone to look for you. It's getting late, so you should return to the palace. Xiao Su said indifferently. Hearing that his Imperial Mother sent someone to look for him, Xiao Ran was filled with panic. He had snuck out this time and never thought that he would be discovered this quickly. However, having his beloved Imperial brother stolen away, Xiao Ran's heart was still filled with injustice. He fiercely glared at Chu Qingyan. If it wasn't for Imperial brother speaking up for you, this prince definitely wouldn't have let you off. After saying this, Xiao Ran quickly left with his people. When the study returned to its original silence, Xiao Su's eyes fell onto Chu Qingyan, who was obediently lowering her head. Although her small body had become a bit chubby, in his eyes, she was still like a bamboo pole. If Chu Qingyan knew what he was thinking, she would definitely not let him off. She had clearly gained a lot of weight. The next time her parents saw her, they probably wouldn't be able to recognize her, all right? Feeling wronged? His voice was indifferent. Chu Qingyan never thought that he would ask her this. She reflexively raised her head, but when she met his calm eyes, her heart trembled. Those eyes seemed to be able to see through her thoughts. She couldn't help looking away. I don't dare. She didn't dare, not she didn't. It could be seen that her heart was still filled with injustice. Xiao Su couldn't help curling his lips. He raised his hand and gently lifted her up. In the blink of an eye, she was already in his arms like a feather. Chu Qingyan never expected that Xiao Su would suddenly make a move. Before she could even cry out in alarm, her entire body fell into his firm and warm embrace. When she was surrounded by the scent of ink, her mind instantly froze. Feeling the person in his arms stiffen, Xiao Su mistakenly thought that she still cared about Xiao Ran's words. After thinking about it, he couldn't help patting her back and awkwardly comforted her. Fourth Imperial brother is still a child. He speaks without thinking, so you don't have to take his words to heart. Xiao Su had never comforted anyone before. He had only seen his subordinates take care of children before, so he learned how to coax children. Unfortunately, he only learned the appearance, but not the essence. Chu Qingyan's internal organs were almost displaced by this forceful pat. If she hadn't heard Xiao Su's words, she would have mistakenly thought that he was using this method to help his Imperial brother vent his anger. Chu Qingyan quickly grabbed Xiao Su's hand. Her eyes were filled with tears as she looked at him pitifully. Lord, I won't take his words to heart. At worst, I'll just avoid the fourth prince when I see him in the future. Xiao Su thought that his comforting words had worked, so he couldn't help taking his hand back. He nodded in satisfaction and said, his personality is like this, but he's not a bad person. If he bullies you in the future, you can just bully him back. He is a noble prince, a golden branch and jade leaves. I'm just a little girl without any power or influence, how could I dare to go against him? Chu Qingyan couldn't help pouting her little mouth as her face filled with depression. Without any power or influence? Then what about this king? Xiao Su's voice was slightly cold. Chu Qingyan heard this and looked at him in surprise. Hearing his tone, it seemed like he wanted to be her backer. Perhaps it was Chu Qingyan's shock that made Xiao Su's expression change. The hand around her waist tightened and an ice-cold aura filled the study. Huo Ling rubbed his arms and moved a few steps away without anyone noticing. Master seemed to be angry. He shouldn't have stayed to watch the play. If he wanted to watch, he should have secretly watched. This was a mistake, a mistake. After being with him for a while, Chu Qingyan more or less understood his personality. Seeing that the situation wasn't right, she immediately reached out her hands to hug Xiao Su's neck. Her face was filled with joy. Lord is Qingyan's big backer, this is great. This sudden intimacy made Xiao Su's conditioned reflex to throw a punch at Chu Qingyan. Chapter 51. But when he saw that pair of intimate and innocent eyes in front of him, his tightly clenched fists immediately loosened. It was a habit formed over the years and he almost threw this child out. Fortunately, he stopped in time, otherwise with her small body, she might not be able to withstand his attack. He relaxed his stiff body and supported her waist with one hand to prevent her from falling. Her breath brushed against his nose. He leaned back in his chair and said with a smile that no one noticed, "It's good that you know. Then can I walk sideways like a crab in the future?" Perhaps it was because she had adapted to Xiao Su's closeness to her, Chu Qingyan seemed to have completely accepted her identity as a 10-year-old child. When she was young, her busy parents had left her in the care of her grandparents. Her family was a scholarly family and had a strict upbringing. Although she had a happy childhood, she was often restrained. Her parents were not by her side and there was no one to act coquettishly with, so she rarely enjoyed the childlike fun that a child should have. Now that Xiao Su was holding her like a child, a long-lost feeling filled her heart, causing her to let down her guard. She couldn't help but hug his neck and pretend to be a tiger. "You can, but the prerequisite is that you have to be under this prince's eyes." Revealing her childlike innocence, it made his lips curl into a faint smile. However, the mask covered his expression, so Chu Qingyan couldn't see it clearly. Doesn't that mean that if she left his sight, she would be hacked to death at any moment? Chu Qingyan gulped. Then she should restrain herself well, otherwise she would lose her life if she wasn't under his watch. As if sensing her thoughts, Xiao Su couldn't help reaching out to tap her nose and said in amusement, "You have evil intentions but no guts." Chu Qingyan puffed up her cheeks when she heard this and replied in dissatisfaction, "What if I'm not under the Lord's watch? Wouldn't my life be in danger? You're saying that this prince doesn't have the ability to protect you?" Having his ability questioned, Xiao Su's voice was low. Chu Qingyan stuck out her tongue when she heard Jiang Yi's words. She hurriedly replied, "Qingyan is joking. The Lord's martial arts are unrivaled and his position is high. Who would dare to bully me?" Xiao Su couldn't help but reach out and pinch her nose as a form of punishment. Finally, he let her go and let her go play in the courtyard by herself. Chu Qingyan didn't understand why he didn't go with her, but she thought that there was still an hour before dinner. He was the Lord. Even if he was ordered to rest in the mansion, he wouldn't be idle like her. Thus, he leisurely walked towards the main courtyard. As soon as Chu Qingyan left, Xiao Su's face darkened. He summoned the white tiger. The white tiger was originally busy in the front courtyard. When he suddenly heard that the Lord had summoned him, he was puzzled but immediately rushed over. "What instructions does the Lord have for summoning this servant?" The white tiger bowed with a respectful expression. "Who is in charge of Yushuan Courtyard today?" His indifferent tone was unfathomable. Although he was already used to his lord's cold personality, for some reason, White Tiger felt that there was something wrong with the lord today. But he still hurriedly replied, "It's Min Qing and Min Feng. Take them away and punish them according to the family rules," Xiao Su said indifferently. The moment he said this, White Tiger's body trembled slightly. He didn't understand why the Lord suddenly wanted to punish these two people. Thinking of the commotion in Yushuan courtyard just now, could it be that the Lord was punishing them for not reporting when the fourth prince entered the courtyard? The white tiger was stunned on the spot. Xiao Su raised his eyebrows slightly. Do you have any objections? This old servant doesn't dare. I'll do it right away. The white tiger immediately accepted the order. The punishment of the family law was not a simple punishment. After 80 beatings, even a strong man would lose 3 of his 7 souls. Not long after, mournful begging for mercy came from outside. The beatings came one after another. Xiao Su had been fighting outside for many years, and the people under him were all experts in the army. When he was enforcing the law, he didn't hesitate at all. Gu Rong and Gu Yi, who were standing outside the study, happened to be facing the front courtyard where the punishment was taking place. A trace of surprise appeared in their eyes. Just because the servants didn't immediately report the news of the fourth prince entering Yushuan courtyard, causing Chu Qingyan to almost be bullied by the fourth prince, the Lord decided to punish these 2 manservants. Gu Rong and Gu Yi were shocked and suddenly felt a burst of fear towards the people in the room. In fact, the 2 of them had already received the news of the fourth prince's arrival long ago. They also knew the purpose of the fourth prince's visit, so they held the attitude of watching a show. First, they wanted to see what kind of blame Chu Qingyan would receive. After all, the 2 of them were sent by Empress Liang to serve the Lord. Like the Empress, they hoped that the Lord would one day become the crown prince. Then, Chu Qingyan, a woman from a poor family with no power and no influence, would have no help to the Lord in his political career. So, although they usually saluted Chu Qingyan, it was always perfunctory. Just like this incident with the fourth prince, they were also happy to see it happen. But they didn't expect that the Lord would punish the people in Yushuan courtyard because of this matter. The meaning of putting the people in the middle of Yushuan courtyard to punish by the family rules was self-evident. This was killing the chicken to warn the monkey, to give the people in the courtyard a wake-up call. Gu Rong and Gu Yi felt a chill run down their backs. In the study, Wu Ling heard the shouts outside getting weaker and weaker, then turned to look at the Lord in front of him who was calmly flipping through the book in his hand. He felt a little curious. He didn't think that the Lord would actually be angry because of Chu Qingyan. Perhaps Wu Ling's gaze was too naked, but Xiao Su raised his eyebrows and looked at him. Is your skin itchy? At this time, the sound of a military rod suddenly sounded outside. Wu Ling was so scared that he covered his butt and shook his head again and again. In the main courtyard, Hong Yi and the others also heard the sound of punishment outside, and each of them had different expressions. Cheng Yi's jealous gaze passed through the window and landed on Chu Qingyan inside. She heard that Lan Yi was reprimanded by the Lord because she wasn't in the study to serve. The Lord was clearly venting for that brat from the Chu family. The more she thought about it, the angrier Cheng Yi became. She was just a child who was still wet behind the ears. How could she be treated differently by the Lord? She wouldn't let her continue to be proud. At this time, Huang Yi walked in with 2 plates of pastries. Seeing Chu Qingyan's large eyes looking around the room, she couldn't help but put the plates in front of her with a smile. Ninth young Miss Chu, these are the pastries the fourth prince brought over from the palace. You can try them. They look very delicate, but they definitely won't be as good as the ones big sister Huang makes. Chu Qingyan looked at them and felt that they looked very good, but when she heard that they were pastries sent by Xiao Ran, her heart subconsciously rejected them. She used this opportunity to praise Huang Yi. Huang Yi was very happy when she heard this. She had to try them and see how they couldn't compare to her own. Unable to resist Huang Yi's enthusiasm, Chu Qingyan casually took a piece and put it in her mouth. It melted in her mouth and had a cold taste. It had to be said that the pastries from the palace were all good things. How is it? Huang Yi's eyes widened as she waited for her answer. Chu Qingyan felt that this little girl was too impatient. She was about to answer when she suddenly felt a metallic taste in her throat. Ninth young Miss Chu. In her haze, she heard Huang Yi's panicked scream. Then her eyes turned black as she fell into a bottomless abyss. Chapter 52. Huang Yi watched as she vomited blood and fainted. She was so frightened that she quickly shouted for help. The people outside heard the commotion and immediately rushed in. Huang Yi saw the fainted Chu Qingyan as soon as she entered and jumped in fright. However, she quickly calmed down and immediately ordered people to do things. Some reported to the Lord, some reported to the Lord, some asked for a doctor, 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 some asked for a doctor. When Xiao Su received the news and rushed over, Chu Qingyan was already lying on the bed with an ashen face. He strode over and sat down on the bed. With a silver mask covering his face, it was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. "Have you called for an imperial doctor?" Huang Yi immediately stood up. "I've already sent people to invite the best doctor in the capital." Because the matter was urgent, she did not have the prince's token to go into the palace to invite an imperial doctor. As soon as she finished speaking, she saw Xiao Su glance at Huoling beside him. Huoling understood tacitly and cupped his hands before quickly leaving the room. Huang Yi knew that Huoling had gone to the palace to invite an imperial doctor. She could not help but order the servants to boil water and prepare a cotton cloth for Chu Qingyan to wipe. Xiao Su stood to the side and watched the servants work. There was an expression in his eyes that others could not see clearly. Huang Yi stood by his side and said in a low voice with concern, "Lord, don't worry. 9th Miss Chu is blessed by the heavens. She will definitely be fine." Xiao Su nodded slightly. He turned around and saw the sobbing Huang Yi and coldly asked, "What exactly happened?" At this time, Huang Yi knelt on the ground in a daze and kowtowed to her lord. "Lord, this servant also does not know what happened." At that time, this servant brought the pastries that the 4th prince brought for 9th Miss Chu to eat. I don't know why, but 9th Miss Chu vomited blood after eating one piece. Huang Yi's words frightened everyone present. They all lowered their heads and did not dare to raise them. If what Huang Yi said was true, then if the pastries that the 4th prince brought were not eaten by Chu Qingyan, but by their lord, the consequences would be unthinkable. Xiao Su heard this and looked at the fruit plate that had not been removed from the table. Someone immediately came forward and took a silver needle to test for poison. When it was brought back, the needle had turned black. That person's expression changed. Looking at the depth of the black color, it was not a simple poison. Xiao Su looked at the silver needles displayed by his subordinate in front of him, and the darkness in his eyes deepened. At this time, the imperial physician that Huoling had invited from the palace also arrived. This imperial physician's surname was Chen, and he had been working in the palace for 10 years. He was quite good at reading people's body language. At this moment, when he saw Prince Ying's cold aura and the person lying on the bed, he immediately understood that the pressure of leaving the palace this time was immense. He had long heard of Prince Ying's reputation for being cold-blooded and cruel. Imperial physician Chen trembled as he placed his finger on Chu Qingyan's pulse. His face instantly turned pale, and when he saw the dark circles under Chu Qingyan's eyes, as well as her purplish-red lips, his legs almost gave out. Reporting to the King of England, the devil's snare is extremely poisonous. I'm afraid that this young lady will not live past tonight." Once these words were said, everyone present was stunned. Although many people did not have much knowledge, they had heard of the 6 great poisons that were rumored outside. Heartbreak grass, poisoned wine, crane red, oleander, throat sealing at the sight of blood, devil's snare. Could it be that this lively and cute little girl was going to die just like that? Imperial physician Chen's words made Xiao Su frown. He subconsciously turned to look at the person lying on the bed. Her usually rosy cheeks were now as pale as paper. Her delicate eyebrows were tightly knitted together, as if she was enduring great pain. From time to time, she would bite her lips and let out a few soft moans. This servant deserves to die. This servant did not take good care of young Lady Chu. Huang Yi immediately kowtowed when she heard this. Her forehead heavily hit the stone floor and the muffled groan seemed to hit everyone's heart. No one dared to breathe loudly, afraid that the Lord would take out his anger on them and send their heads rolling. Huo Ling, send Ethereal. Xiao Su suddenly said as he reached out to stroke Chu Qingyan's pale face. Huo Ling jumped in fright and blurted out, Lord, Ethereal is in Shannon. It will take at least 3 days to get back. Give him 2 days' time. Xiao Su said emotionlessly. He turned to look at the trembling imperial physician Chen and ordered calmly, no matter what, give this king 2 days to keep her alive. Imperial physician Chen's eyes darkened. At this moment, he was extremely regretful that he was on duty today. Now that the King of England had given the order and the knife was on his neck, he could only try everything he could. Sure enough, a person's potential was limitless. Imperial physician Chen used all his skills and finally managed to save her from the gates of hell. But whether he could save her life in the end, no one could say for sure. Huo Ling also did not stop to send the order to Ethereal. In these 2 days, everyone in Yushuan courtyard was suffering unspeakably. Although their lord looked the same as usual, they could feel the temperature around them getting lower and lower. It was clearly almost summer, but they often broke out in cold sweat when facing the Lord. Huang Yi had already knelt in the courtyard for nearly 2 days. The Lord did not punish her, but she did not dare to get up. Huang Yi felt uncomfortable when she saw this and wanted to advise her, but she heard Qing Yi's harsh voice ring out, I don't know what kind of good fortune this Chu Qingyan has cultivated to be able to receive such treatment from the Lord. Huang Yi turned to look at her with a serious expression, Qing Yi, this time is different from the past. You better not be inaccurate with your words, otherwise you will suffer when the time comes. Qing Yi pursed her lips in defiance, but she knew that what she said was not without reason. Her eyes glanced towards the room Chu Qingyan was in, her gaze vicious, hoping that Chu Qingyan would die from the poison. Huang Yi did not say anything more and ordered people to send Huang Yi, who had fainted from the sun, back to her room. And in the room, Chu Qingyan, who was being kept alive by Imperial physician Chen, was sometimes awake and sometimes asleep. At this time, her eyes were half open, looking at the muslin canopy above her head, a little confused. Hearing movement, Xiao Su put down the book in his hand and got up to walk towards her. You're awake. Chu Qingyan used a lot of effort to turn her head to look at the person standing gracefully in front of her bed. A bad premonition in her heart and an indescribable pain all over her body made her heart cold. Her lips parted slightly, her voice soft and weak, Lord, will I die? Without her family by her side, although the person in front of her was cold, at least he had been with her for a period of time. The grievances, fear and sadness in her heart, she could not help but pour them out. Xiao Su looked at her silently. Although he did not say anything, he raised his hand to gently stroke her head, as if he was comforting her. Chu Qingyan slightly grinned. Thinking that if she did not live, she had to quickly say her last words, Lord, Qingyan is very sad. It was not easy for me to live and I have not seen this world properly, but fate is not kind to me. If Qingyan dies, please take into account that Qingyan has been obedient these past few days, help take care of Qingyan's parents. Qingyan is most worried about them in this life. Qingyan does not dare to trouble the Lord and only hopes that the Lord can make things convenient and not let them suffer. Cough cough, shut up, did this prince say that you will die? Xiao Su was annoyed by her last words, which were full of righteousness. When he finished speaking, he did not hear any sound from below. It turned out that she had fainted again. Xiao Su's expression was very ugly. Chapter 53. Just as Imperial physician Chen was at his wit's end, Huo Ling hurried into the courtyard with a handsome man. Ethereal greets Lord. The handsome man immediately bowed when he saw Xiao Su. He sized up his lord from head to toe and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that he was unharmed. He had thought that he had been urgently summoned back because the lord had been poisoned. "He's there." Xiao Su nodded. Ethereal did not dare to stop and immediately walked over to the bed. But when he saw that the patient he was about to treat was a child, Ethereal was surprised but immediately walked over. The devil's snare poison had already invaded the child's blood but had been stopped and had not had time to spread. But now, the poison had started to move again. If he did not do anything, it would invade his lungs. Ethereal did not dare to delay. "Someone, prepare the bathtub." Hong Yi immediately ordered the servants to do so. Ethereal wrote down the medicine to be soaked in later and handed it to Hong Yi to get the medicine. Seeing that Ethereal was preparing everything in an orderly manner, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. At this time, Gu Rong came in to report that the fourth prince was asking for an audience. Everyone turned to look at their lord. The suspicion that the fourth prince had poisoned the child had been floating in everyone's hearts. Now that he dared to come and ask for an audience, was he not afraid that the lord would be angry? But the fourth prince had liked to stick to the lord's side since he was young. Although the lord was always cold, the fourth prince seemed to become more courageous with every setback. He did not care about how fierce the conflict between the fourth prince's faction and the King of England's faction was. "I won't see him," Xiao Su said calmly. Gu Rong immediately accepted the order and left. But not long after, they heard a commotion approaching Yuxian courtyard. Xiao Su was not surprised to see Xiao Ran barging his way in. Gu Rong followed beside him with a face full of self-blame. If the fourth prince were to force his way in, he would not be able to stop him. Xiao Ran, who had originally been furious, had actually dared to stop him from seeing his imperial brother. However, when he saw the person in front of him, Xiao Ran's expression immediately became unnatural. However, when he saw the servant entering and exiting the courtyard with a bag of medicine in his hand, he immediately reacted. He took 2 steps forward and hurriedly explained, "Imperial brother, it really wasn't Qin Di." "How could Qin Di harm you?" Xiao Su narrowed his eyes and looked at Huoling beside him. After following by Lord's side for so many years, he could naturally guess the meaning of his lord's glance. Huoling also did not expect the news to spread so quickly. He said, "This subordinate immediately sealed the news that day. The people in the manor cannot possibly leak it out." However, at this moment, not only did the fourth prince know about it, but there were also rumors among the people that the fourth prince had murdered his own brother. It was likely that there was a mastermind behind all this. Xiao Ren immediately said, "Does Imperial brother still want to hide this matter from Qin Di?" "If I did not hear the palace servants say it, Qin Di would probably still be in the dark." However, Qin Di also does not know why those pastries would be poisonous. Qin Di has already captured the people in the imperial kitchen and interrogated them one by one. However, no one is suspicious. When he said this, Xiao Ran's face was filled with frustration. Xiao Su looked at the vexed person in front of him. Only he could turn the imperial palace upside down without angering his imperial brother. Xiao Su's expression did not change as he said, "It's fine. You don't need to blame yourself. Imperial brother, you believe that Qin Di did not harm you." Xiao Ran was still a 12-year-old youth. The emotions in his heart quickly showed on his face. Xiao Su did not answer. Instead, he waved his hand and said, "It's getting late. Your imperial mother should be worried. Go back." Although his imperial brother did not directly admit it, Xiao Ran could still feel it. Since his imperial brother had already spoken, there was no reason for him to stay any longer. After bidding farewell, he took his leave and returned to the palace with his people. At this moment, Turin appeared. He looked at his master beside him with a face full of surprise. "Lord, why didn't you use this opportunity to strike back at Consort you? Recently, Consort you had been causing trouble for Lord quite a bit." Even this corruption case inexplicably implicating Lord was due to Consort you adding fuel to the fire behind the scenes. Xiao Su glanced at him. Although his expression was indifferent, it made people feel as if they were under 1,000 pounds of pressure. Turan lowered his head and did not dare to continue speaking. However, in his heart, he felt that it was unfair for his master. For many years, his master had allowed others to bully him, but because of the brotherhood between them, he had never made things difficult for those people. However, after those people tasted the sweetness, they became even more vicious. It was truly too hateful. Prepare the horse. Ben Wang wants to enter the palace. Xiao Su saw that Chu Qingyan had already begun her treatment. At this time, her life should not be in danger, so he began to walk out. Yes. Although Gu Rong and Gu Yi were surprised, they still immediately responded and went to make arrangements. Inside the palace, Empress Liang was resting on a chair with her eyes closed when a palace servant suddenly came to report that the King of England was requesting an audience. Empress Liang immediately opened her eyes. This was the first time he had taken the initiative to enter the palace. Empress Liang couldn't help but wave her hand to let him in. What wind blew you to Bengong today? Seeing the person who had come, Empress Liang's tone was harsh as she mocked him. Imperial Mother knows in her heart. Xiao Su stood in the hall and calmly replied. Empress Liang's trusted aide Luo Yun and Luo Gugu, who were standing to the side, thought that His Highness had entered the palace to reminisce with the Empress. However, they did not expect that the two would not get along. Empress Liang's eyebrows jumped. She felt a bit uneasy, but she quickly calmed down. She raised a white jade finger and blew on the flowers on it. A cold smile appeared at the corner of her mouth as she said, "Oh? Then Imperial Mother does not know. Su-er, if you have something to say, just say it. Imperial Mother is not an outsider. There is no need to speak in riddles with Imperial Mother." In that case, I will speak openly. Xiao Su looked steadily at the person in front of him. Imperial Mother, Chu Qingyan was the one that Imperial Grandfather bestowed the marriage. You don't have to take the trouble to get rid of her. She didn't expect him to be so smart and quickly realized that the poisoning incident was caused by her. She unconsciously stilled, but her face quickly turned cold and she angrily said, "Su-er, don't disappoint Imperial Mother's painstaking efforts. Right now, you are suspected by your Fuwang of embezzling the treasury silver. You may not be anxious, but Imperial Mother does not have such good composure. With such a good opportunity, we can kill two birds with one stone. We can destroy Xiao Ran's reputation and get rid of Chu Qingyan, that damned girl. Imperial Mother is helping you clear out the obstacles. Is this how you treat Imperial Mother? You came here in the middle of the night just to denounce me?" Facing the agitated and angry Empress Liang, Xiao Su was unmoved. "I will handle Imperial Mother's matter. There is no need for Imperial Mother to worry. Imperial Father is not a muddle-headed person and will give I justice. Moreover, Imperial Mother should clearly see one thing. Even if there is no Chu Qingyan today, there will be Li Qingyan and Zhao Qingyan in the future. Thus, Imperial Mother does not need to take the trouble." Justice? Empress Liang sneered. "If your Imperial Father had you in his eyes, why would you be sent out to the border to suffer so much hardship for so many years? If your Imperial Father had you in his eyes, why would he allow someone to impeach you despite knowing that you were wrongly accused? If your Imperial Father had you in his eyes, why would he allow that slut's son to climb over your head? Su-er, after so many years, do you still not understand?" Empress Liang became more and more agitated as she spoke. Her eyes were red and full of hatred. Chapter 54. Aunt Luo hurriedly stepped forward to appease Empress Liang, who was unable to restrain her anger. She turned to look at the King of England, who was standing quietly in the hall. Her tone was full of pity. "Your Highness, Her Majesty the Empress is doing this for your own good. She has worried so much for you all these years. Xiao Su lowered his eyebrows as his gaze fell on the brick in front of him. However, if someone were to look closely, they would discover that his eyes, which were as black as ink, were currently as gloomy as the thick fog on the horizon. Seeing that Xiao Su didn't say anything, Empress Liang thought that he had already compromised, so she leaned on the back of the golden chair and adjusted her breathing. In an instant, she returned to being the high and mighty queen of the harem. She slowly raised her hand to stroke the hem of her 100 birds, paying homage to the phoenix skirt on her knees, and raised her chin. This time Mother Empress painstakingly grasped the fourth prince's weakness. You should make good use of it. Although you can't push him into the quagmire in one fell swoop, you can also plant a little stain in the hearts of the officials. In the future, you can make good use of it. Don't worry about concubine Yun's concubine. Empress Liang's eyes suddenly flashed with a touch of viciousness, that Chu Qingyan must die, otherwise it will attract the attention of the officials. His thin lips were pursed, and his head was lowered. He slowly raised his gaze, his eyes without any ripples. Mother Empress, forgive I for not being able to agree to this matter. What? Empress Liang, who was full of plans, was suddenly doused with ice-cold water by his words, and she lost her composure in shock. Chu Qingyan saved I, and I can't repay kindness with enmity. Therefore, I will protect Chu Qingyan's life. Please don't involve her in these disputes again. Xiao Su said faintly, his tone firm, as if no one could refute it. So what if she saved you? Above the imperial power, who didn't step on bloody skulls step by step to reach the top? An insignificant life, like an ant. Wouldn't it be at your mercy? Besides, no one in this world can cure the devil's snare poison. You'd better not waste your efforts. Empress Liang angrily looked at her stubborn son in front of her. She wished she could tear open his brain and see what he was thinking. Why was she always going against her? Xiao Su felt that it would be pointless to continue talking with her, so he said with an indifferent expression, Imperial Mother, I have already grown up. I have my own path to walk, so there's no need for Imperial Mother to worry about me. It's already late, so I won't disturb Imperial Mother's rest. I will take my leave. Empress Liang still wanted to say something, but Xiao Su didn't wait for her to speak. He turned around and left with large strides. At this time, a palace servant entered the hall with a secret report in his hand. Seeing the Empress's expression, he didn't dare to say anything and directly handed it to Aunt Luo. Aunt Luo opened the letter and said to Empress Liang, Nyang, the informant in His Highness Fu sent a letter. What did he say? Empress Liang was so angry that her chest was heaving up and down. When she heard the letter, she thought that it was about Chu Qingyan's death. Joy flashed through her eyes. When Aunt Luo saw the contents, her eyes widened. Nyang, Chu Qingyan was saved. Empress Liang's breath was stuck in her throat. She grabbed a teacup and smashed it on the ground. She worked so hard and painstakingly planned for him, but what she got in return was his disdain. She wanted Chu Qingyan to die, but he insisted on saving her. The Liang family's future, as well as her bright future, all depended on him. But he never took it to heart and allowed others to humiliate her. He could endure it, but she couldn't tolerate that slut riding roughshod over her. Unwillingness, anger, resentment, they all surged in her heart. Her eyes were red and her fingers clasped the armrest, her veins popping. She swore that she would sit in that position and make that slut's life a living hell. One by one, she would repay the sufferings and pain of the past 20 years. The crisp cracking sound behind him gradually disappeared in the dark night as he moved forward. At the end of May, early June, summer was coming. When he passed by the imperial garden, he could still hear one or two frogs croaking. But he didn't know why, but he felt a trace of coldness. He looked up and saw the palace lanterns in front of him winding along the long corridor. The dim yellow light fell on the bluestone, but in his eyes, it was misty. There was a road in front, but it seemed that there was no road. Suddenly, he missed the smiling face in the palace. The palace was too cold. For the first time, he couldn't wait to return to the palace. His swaying voice suddenly tightened. He strode closer and closer to the palace gate. In the King of England's palace. Ethereal wiped the sweat from his forehead. His clothes were wet, as if he had just been fished out of the water. In fact, he had just gone to fight with the King of Hell. Fortunately, he had won the battle, otherwise he didn't know how to explain it to his master. He turned his head to look at the pale-faced Chu Qingyan who was already out of danger. He couldn't help being puzzled. He was staying in Shannon, but Chu Qingyan was urgently called over by Hualing to save this little girl. Although he knew that the Lord had been bestowed a marriage by the Emperor, he had never taken Chu Qingyan seriously. How could a weak and powerful woman be worthy of their master? But when he learned that it was his master who gave the order, he was shocked. He carefully looked at the person. He was clearly a child and he couldn't see his beauty. When he examined him, he found that this child had suffered a lot in his early years. His body was thin and weak, and his blood was lacking. Fortunately, he had been recuperated in the palace, so he was slightly better. But this time, the poison had entered his body, so it would take a while for his body to recover. There was clearly nothing outstanding about him, so why did his master treat him differently? So Ethereal couldn't help turning his gaze to Hualing, who let out a sigh of relief. Hualing met his gaze and couldn't help waving his hand. I know what you want to ask, but I really don't know how to answer this question. I can only say that the girl inside saved the Lord once. That was before we returned to the capital. Ethereal rolled his eyes at him. It's a pity that you're still following by your master's side. You're simply wasting your eyes. Hualing choked on his words and coldly snorted. Do you think it's that easy for us subordinates to guess master's thoughts? You're too naive. The night wind blew over and blew Ethereal's clothes dry. He flicked his sleeves and placed them behind his back. The night wind blew up his clothes and his white clothes fluttered, giving him a celestial feeling. Hualing unhappily looked away. Ever since he was young, he hated this celestial appearance of his the most. Ethereal did not care about Hualing's coldness. He threw down a sentence, if the Lord needs anything, call me. Then he floated away. He had been on horseback for the past few days and hadn't closed his eyes for 3 days and 3 nights. Now that he was completely relaxed, he felt like his entire body didn't belong to him anymore. He was a doctor who was obsessed with cleanliness, so enduring these past few days was already his limit. Now that his entire body was sticky, he wished he could immediately take a bath. Hualing stared at the sleeve that was about to fly up. He ridiculed in his heart, truly an embroidered pillow. Chapter 55. By the time Xiao Su returned to the king's palace, it was already halfway through the night. He slowly walked into the room where Chu Qingyan was placed. Ethereal had already rushed over after receiving the news and was following him to report the situation. Master, this subordinate has already cleaned the poison from the young miss of the Chu family. There isn't much of a problem right now, but her body's foundation isn't very good. The poison this time may have damaged her foundation and she needs to rest for a while. Kong Ling noticed that when he mentioned that Chu Qingyan's foundation was not good and that she had injured her foundation, his master's expression did not look too good. Kong Ling thought to himself, it seems like my master is still paying attention to this Chu Qingyan. You shouldn't return to Sha Nan for a while. If you need any medicine, just tell the White Tiger. Xiao Su left this order. Then he turned around and entered the room. Ethereal's footsteps paused as he looked at his master in disbelief. Chu Qingyan's body could be given to a normal doctor or an imperial doctor. Wasn't it a bit overkill to have him stay here to take care of this girl? But when he heard the second half of the order, he raised an eyebrow. His master wanted to take care of her body at all costs. When Xining, who was serving Chu Qingyan, saw someone come in, she quickly opened the curtain for Xiao Su. She didn't think that Lord would come in at this time. Lord. Xining was just about to bow when she was stopped by a look from Xiao Su. He waved his hand. Xining understood and left. Soon, he was the only one left in the room. Ethereal also received his order and left. There was a lamp in the room, but in order to take care of the sleeping Chu Qingyan, it was moved far away. The moonlight coming in from the window couldn't compare to it. Xiao Su used this silver moonlight to look at the person on the bed. Although the devil's snare had been removed, her face was still pale. Thinking back to the first time he saw her, her red face was very cute. He sat down on the bed, his gaze still on her body. Although she looked timid, she was actually very bold. Normally, she was like a little kitten that hid its claws. When she couldn't take it anymore, she would show her claws. For example, that time when he had teased her to the point of no return, she had angrily come to him to settle accounts. Thinking of her wonderful face at the time, Xiao Su couldn't help raising the corner of his lips. Thinking of the times he teased her, his heart gradually calmed down. The pursuit of fame and fortune, the schemes of mutual deception, the broken voice, the angry scolding, and the cold indifference in the depths of his memory seemed to be far away. Xiao Su leaned against the wall of the bed and looked at the person sleeping peacefully. He felt an indescribable sense of peace. Time passed quickly and the night was over. And seeing Lord leave, Xining finally let go of her fear and entered the room. After a while, Chu Qingyan slowly opened her eyes. When her eyes adjusted to the light in front of her, her muddled mind gradually became clear. Water, she opened her mouth, but it was dry. When Xining heard her voice, she immediately held a cup of water and slowly brought it to her mouth, feeding her little by little. When her throat felt better, Chu Qingyan shook her head. She wanted to raise her hand to support her forehead, but she found that her body was weak and she didn't even have the strength to raise her hand. Chu Qingyan was startled. At this time, the forgotten memories came back to her. She remembered the black blood before she fainted and couldn't help being surprised. Xining, what happened to me? Seeing her mistress alive and well in front of her eyes, the tears that Xining had been holding back for 3 days finally flowed out. She cried, "Mistress, you were poisoned a few days ago after eating the pastries brought by the fourth prince." A few days ago. Chu Qingyan frowned. Yes, you were unconscious for 3 days. Fortunately, Lord brought a highly skilled doctor, otherwise, the poison of the devil's snare. Xining cried and didn't continue. Devil's snare. She often heard about it in TV dramas, but she didn't expect it to happen to her. Chu Qingyan sucked in a breath. It seems that she and the fourth prince obviously didn't get along well. Eating his food, she was almost poisoned to death. Fortunately, the King of England saw that she was his fiancée and saved her life. Chu Qingyan couldn't help but have a headache. She seemed to owe the King of England a big favor. Forget it, she'll pay it back when she has the chance in the future. Xining, I'm a little hungry. She hadn't eaten for 3 days and had been relying on those medicinal decoctions, so her stomach was already empty. Xining originally wanted to tell her master that Lord had accompanied her for the entire night, but her master interrupted her. Her attention was immediately focused on the matter of her being hungry, so she hurriedly nodded. In the study, Xiao Su sat quietly, his 2 capable subordinates, Huling and Turin, standing in front of him. Turin reported. Lord, today, Wang Chang's family has been convicted, and 9 generations of his family will be executed after autumn. Lin Fengzheng has found many people who are related to him in the past 2 days, and they have all been imprisoned. This corruption case could be considered to have come to an end. Although Huling was happy that his lord had been cleared of suspicion, he also felt that it was strange. Lord, you said that this matter had been dragging on for a long time, and that Lin Fengzheng was also racking his brains to find a reliable crime to frame you. How did the case end so quickly? Do you think there's something strange about this? Turin coldly chuckled. Isn't it because the Fu clan was loyal to the Lord for the sake of the fourth prince? With Turin's reminder, Huling instantly understood. Chu Qingyan had been poisoned by the fourth prince's pastries. Although the lord had sealed the news, the empress had still used some means to privately spread the news. The Fu clan, or perhaps it would be better to say that Consort Yu, was worried that Xiao Su would use this opportunity to retaliate, so they were the first to react and quickly put an end to the corruption case, no longer spending time trying to frame the lord. This could be considered doing Lord a favor, because on the surface, it was His Majesty who wanted to investigate Lord, not them. Although they had only added fuel to the fire, these wily old foxes would never admit to it. At this time, White Tiger walked in. Lord, His Majesty sent people to deliver many precious herbs and silk, saying that it was a reward for the Chu clan's young miss. The accompanying eunuch told this old servant to pass on the message that the cooks in the imperial kitchen who made the pastries that day have already been punished. Xiao Su nodded indifferently. For the Fu clan, imperial father's actions were not just to appease him, but also to keep the peace. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, revealing a smile that was not a smile. Huling and Turin's expressions changed. They could tell what His Majesty meant. He was telling Lord not to pursue the fourth prince's mistakes. They all looked at their master in front of them. Right now, their master was probably feeling terrible. His Majesty favored the fourth prince too much. Xiao Su inadvertently saw a figure outside the window and waved his hand to call her in. Chapter 56. The person who passed by was none other than Xining, who was preparing food for Chu Qingyan. Wang, Lord, do you have any orders? Xining stammered as she was intimidated by Xiao Su's powerful aura. Xining's hand was trembling, and the lid of the bowl was knocked up and down. Xiao Su frowned as he looked at the bowl of porridge. Your mistress is awake. Xining immediately replied, Mistress has just woken up. This servant was just about to deliver this bowl of porridge to mistress. Xiao Su said, Let's go. Xining didn't know what Lord meant. Fortunately, she was quick-witted and immediately followed him. After turning left and right, they quickly arrived at the room. Chu Qingyan was originally resting with her eyes closed. When she heard the noise, she calculated the time and guessed that Xining had returned. She opened her eyes with great effort. Unexpectedly, the first thing that came into view was the corner of a black robe. She was slightly stunned. A clear and cold voice, like jade and stone, sounded softly in her ear. Awake? This familiar voice startled her for a moment. These few days, she was unconscious and muddle-headed. She felt that her life was like duckweed rising and falling. If that voice hadn't suddenly pulled her up when she was about to sink, she might have fallen into a deep sleep and never see the light again. Yes. Chu Qingyan replied softly. She hadn't spoken for a few days and her voice was hoarse beyond recognition. Xiao Su couldn't help but frown when he heard this, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he looked at Xining. Xining suddenly received Lord's gaze indirectly. She subconsciously trembled, then understood his meaning. She quickly carried the bowl of porridge to her mistress. After helping her mistress to lean against the bed, she carefully opened the lid of the cup and scooped a spoonful for her mistress. Perhaps it was because the Lord was staring at her from the side, Xining's heart was filled with fear, causing her hand that was holding the spoon to tremble. Before the porridge reached her master's lips, a lot of it had spilled. Xining wanted to cry but had no tears. However, the fear of the Lord in her bones made her unable to restrain herself even if she wanted to. Chu Qingyan also felt that something was wrong with Ao Xining. Just as she was about to raise her hand and eat it herself, someone who was emitting a cold aura said, You can leave first. Xining felt as if she had been pardoned. She immediately put down the porridge and turned to leave. Before she left, she threw a tearful look at her mistress. Chu Qingyan pursed her lips. If you think it's not good enough to keep me here, then don't run away so quickly. The sound of a chair rubbing against the ground was heard. Chu Qingyan looked over in confusion, but what she saw made her horrified. The high and mighty King of England actually picked up the bowl of porridge and sat beside her. It seemed that he was going to take over the task of Xining. But she had never dared to think about this scene. Such a down-to-earth lord, the scene was too beautiful for her to look at. Because she would think that she was hallucinating. But the hallucination soon became reality. That spoonful of scalding porridge was forcefully shoved into her mouth. Chu Qingyan felt that it was really scalding. Originally, she had been tortured by the strong poison this time. Only her mouth could move. Chu Qingyan couldn't stand the hot porridge and spat it out. But as soon as she spat it out, Chu Qingyan regretted it. The person in front of her was the noble lord. It was already a great honor for him to give up his identity to take care of her. But he was met with such a reaction from her. He would probably leave in a huff. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but steal a glance at the person in front of her. Sure enough, Xiao Su's face was already showing signs of darkening. Chu Qingyan's heart was filled with grief. She hurriedly explained, "I didn't do it on purpose. It was too hot." Only then did Xiao Su notice her slightly red and swollen lips. It was probably because she was scalded just now. His expression softened a little, and then he stared at the porridge in his hand, as if waiting for it to cool down. He could wait, but her stomach couldn't. She couldn't help but purse her lips and suggest, "You can blow on it." Xiao Su glanced at her with his deep eyes. Chu Qingyan silently explained in her heart, "This king put down his status to take care of you, and you actually dare to criticize me?" Chu Qingyan blushed with shame at her wild imagination. Although Xiao Su didn't say anything, he really did as she said. He placed the porridge in front of her and blew on it before handing it to Chu Qingyan. But good times didn't last long. His Royal Highness, who had no experience in taking care of people, either didn't control his strength well, or scooped the porridge too full. If Chu Qingyan didn't knock her teeth out, then she almost choked to death. Before she finished feeding him half of the porridge, Chu Qingyan felt that she had already been tormented quite badly. She was afraid that if she continued like this, even if she didn't die from the devil's snare, half of her life would be gone. In order to save her less than half life, she felt that she needed to express her opinion to him. Lord, Qingyan should do it herself. Saying this, she raised her hand to take the spoon in his hand. Xiao Su's hand slightly moved away, as he looked at her with cold eyes. "Are you sure you still have the strength?" Chu Qingyan choked, and at this moment, her hand went limp. "If you have the strength to speak, why don't you save the strength to eat?" Saying this, he stuffed a big mouthful of porridge into her mouth. Chu Qingyan looked at the big spoonful in front of her with teary eyes, and she suddenly had the thought of dying. After 81 tribulations, this small bowl of porridge took an entire hour to feed. And the person who should have eaten her fill and had the strength seemed to have experienced an abyss of suffering. Her whole body went limp on the bed, gasping for air. When she saw Xiao Su take back his hand, she almost shed tears of gratitude. She finally finished eating. It was simply a disaster, okay? Perhaps her lips were already broken. As if he didn't feel Chu Qingyan's expression of escaping from disaster, Xiao Su looked at the empty bowl with satisfaction, then put down the bowl and got up. He said to Chu Qingyan, "Have a good rest. If you need anything, let the maid serving you tell Hong Yi." Chu Qingyan hurriedly nodded, wishing that she could immediately send this great deity away. Perhaps because he was in a good mood, Xiao Su didn't notice her abnormality. If it was any other time, he would definitely tease her a bit, call for the servants to serve her, and then leave in large strides. Xining was summoned into the room. Looking at her master on the bed, who looked like she wanted to swallow her whole, Xining bashfully smiled. "Master, are you still feeling unwell?" "My heart doesn't feel well." After Xiao Su left, Chu Qingyan immediately showed her true colors and rolled her eyes at her. "You have the nerve to run away at the last minute?" leaving me to face His Highness alone. Lord's aura is too strong, this servant can't stand it. Ever since she followed Master, Xining also learned a few words of English. Chu Qingyan coldly snorted. In fact, she was also clear that other people were afraid of Xiao Su. She couldn't help but wave her hand and let this little girl go. She was just joking with her. Perhaps to other people, to be able to receive the care of the King of England was a blessing from their previous life, but to her, it was a bit bad. Instead, she hoped that Xiao Su would be acting on a whim and not condescending in the future. She couldn't afford it. Otherwise, this little life of hers wouldn't be enough for her to torment. Chu Qingyan guessed correctly. The first time, it was Xiao Su acting on a whim, but in the future, it wouldn't be as simple as a whim. Chapter 57. So for the next few days, Chu Qingyan began to suffer unspeakably. This prince seemed to be addicted to feeding her. Every day, he would report to her bedside at mealtime. Every time the kitchen prepared medicinal cuisine, he would take it away. Then, he would sit in front of the bed with his back straight and feed her methodically. To be honest, although Xiao Su's face was covered by a mask and his appearance couldn't be seen and he was emitting an unapproachable aura, if one only looked at his appearance, they would find him very pleasing to the eye. But being pleasing to the eye couldn't be used as food. For the past few days, Chu Qingyan had been eating sausages in her mouth. She even felt like dying. But facing this great Buddha, she couldn't resist even if she wanted to. So on this day, Chu Qingyan watched with watery eyes as Xiao Su sat down again with a bowl of medicinal congee. Chu Qingyan felt that she had to do something. Lord, it's already been 3 days. Qingyan's body is much better now. Lord is busy with official matters, so you don't need to worry about taking care of Qingyan. Seeing her anxiously looking at him, Xiao Su raised his brows and muttered to himself, Imperial Father excused this king from morning court for the next few days and told this king to take good care of you. Your recovery is this king's official matter. So it's perfectly justifiable. Chu Qingyan couldn't help complaining about the Sichuan emperor that she had never met before. He was too meddlesome. Although she felt that she was being unreasonable, she still couldn't forgive the Sichuan emperor. If it wasn't for him, she wouldn't have suffered such an undeserved disaster. Open your mouth. Xiao Su saw her tightly shut lips and said impatiently. Chu Qingyan subconsciously opened her mouth and a large mouthful of medicinal congee was stuffed into her mouth. She didn't have time to react before she choked. The medicinal congee that had just entered her mouth sprayed all over the bed. Even Xiao Su's body was not spared. Cough, cough, I didn't do it on purpose, Chu Qingyan coughed until her face turned red. She was about to cough her lungs out. Xiao Su frowned and patted her back. However, a man's strength was incomparable to a woman's strength. Moreover, Xiao Su spent most of his time in the military camp and rarely came into contact with women. He also didn't know how to take care of people, so the way he patted her back wasn't very gentle. As a result, Chu Qingyan's internal organs were almost knocked out by him. So, softer, softer. Chu Qingyan was about to cry. Xiao Su couldn't help but stop when he felt her trembling. His brows were tinged with a thin layer of anger. He waited for her to catch her breath before speaking. Do you think that this prince doesn't know how to take care of people? Chu Qingyan wanted to nod, but she waved her hand against her will. Why would I? Qingyan feels that Lord is omnipotent. To be able to receive Lord's care, it is Qingyan's good fortune from her previous life. Perhaps it was because Chu Qingyan's words were too exaggerated and perfunctory, but Xiao Su only glanced at her before flicking his sleeves and leaving. Chu Qingyan rubbed her chest and finally managed to relax. When she looked up, she saw the corner of Xiao Su's clothes disappear at the door. She couldn't help being confused. Why did His Royal Highness just leave without saying goodbye? But no matter how she guessed, she could never guess that a certain person had flicked his sleeves and left because he was angry from embarrassment. After leaving the room, Xiao Su turned and walked into the study. At this time, he had an unhappy expression on his face. When Hualing came in at this time and saw his master covered in rice grains, he couldn't help being shocked. Lord was famous for being obsessed with cleanliness, so how could he allow these things to stain his body today? It really was like the sun was rising from the west. Hualing, what do you think is lacking in this king? Xiao Su asked with narrowed eyes as he pulled him in. Hualing had just looked away from the rice grains on Lord's body, but when he heard Lord's strange question, he was even more shocked. Could it be that the sun wasn't rising from the west today, but rather that Lord was possessed? Seeing Hualing look like he had eaten a fly, Xiao Su immediately regretted asking this question. But words that had been said were like water that had been spilled, so it was hard to take them back. Seeing Lord's expression become ugly, Hualing quickly replied, Lord is wise and powerful, his martial arts are unparalleled, he is outstanding and talented. This subordinate only sees Lord's good points. If there is anything lacking, it would be that there is nothing lacking. Hearing Hualing's glib praise, Xiao Su's expression sunk even more. But some people think that this king doesn't know how to take care of people. Hualing immediately reacted. Lord's abnormality must be related to the Chu family's young miss. Hualing was puzzled. That person had just entered the palace not long ago, but she was able to affect Lord's mood. It really was impressive. However, although Lord was his master, Hualing couldn't help but complain. Every time he saw Lord feed Chu Qingyan, he felt like it wasn't a gift, but a punishment. Thinking of how Chu Qingyan was still recovering, Hualing couldn't help but say a few words for her. Lord, as the saying goes, there are specializations. Your strength lies in the overall situation. Leading troops into battle, being diligent and caring for the people, and taking care of people is not something you need to do personally. Xiao Su stared at this insincere subordinate and already had an answer in his heart. Hualing felt goosebumps all over his body from being stared at like this and complained in his heart. Summon all the generals that came with the army for this king. What? Lord's rhythm was jumping a bit too fast and he actually couldn't keep up. So, in the closed study, there were 4 or 5 long tables that were filled with Xiao Su's subordinates that were fighting outside. In front of them were brushes, ink, paper, and inkstones. Xiao Su stood behind the main table and looked down at everyone with his hands behind his back. You have all followed this king for at least 3 years. Whether it was the Battle of Ganluan or the crossing of wood and water, you have all never left this king. This king has placed a difficult problem in front of me and hopes that everyone can help me. For Lord, we will not hesitate to go through fire and water. If you have any orders, please tell us. Everyone cupped their hands and spoke in a loud voice. So everyone that was filled with confidence heard this difficult problem. How were they supposed to take care of a child that was still half-grown? The subordinates all picked up their brushes and looked at each other, but they didn't know what to do. General A, Lord, this humble servant is only a martial artist. This kind of thing should be left to the civil servants. Just now, you will not hesitate to go through fire and water? Xiao Su looked over and General A immediately lowered his head. He bit his brush and scratched his head. General B, Lord, this humble servant is good at giving advice in politics. This matter is a bit hard for this humble servant to do. Who was it that said to tell us anything? Xiao Su revealed a faint smile, but everyone could hear the threat in his words. General B immediately dipped his brush in ink and began to write. Seeing that everyone was writing at a high speed, Xiao Su sat down calmly and closed his eyes to rest. The fire spirit servant stood on the side and took a deep breath. So the urgent matter that Lord said he had to discuss was for this matter? This was too inconceivable. If Turin and the others were here, their eyes would probably fall out of their sockets. Everyone racked their brains and wrote until they were dizzy. The answers that they handed in were all placed in front of Xiao Su. Parenting scripture, on the way of being a father. Xiao Su flipped through them one by one while the fire spirit servant secretly watched from the side. The more he looked, the more his eyes couldn't help twitching. All the content could be summed up in 3 words. Pet, pet, pet. Chapter 58. After the generals and advisors left feeling dizzy and weak, Xiao Su looked at the stack of papers in front of him. He tapped the table with his hand and fell into deep thought. His face was a bit ugly and his eyes narrowed. He had to be kind to the child and be as warm as spring. Kind? What kind of attitude was that? It was too abstract. Impossible. Give what she asked for. This could be done as long as it wasn't too excessive. Accompany her at all times. Reluctantly, Xiao Su picked through the papers and filtered out the ones that were barely acceptable. Only then did his expression relax. On the side, Ling watched as the generals and scholars who were normally fierce and powerful waved their swords and laughed freely. When they saw the papers that they normally couldn't think of, their eyes almost popped out. After racking their brains to finish, they all looked like frosted eggplants, losing their usual high-spirited attitude. He held it in. He wanted to laugh, but he didn't dare, afraid that he would be punished by his master. But when his eyes turned to Lord behind the desk, he saw that Lord's expression was serious, as if he was facing a battle. Being so serious, Ling put away his emotions and fell into deep thought. It was hard to imagine that this Chu Qingyan could actually make his master make this kind of decision. And it was clear that this decision was beyond his understanding of following Lord for more than 10 years. It really was strange. Just as Ling flew into the sky, he heard Lord's voice ring out. Tell Huang Yi to bring a plate of candied fruit along with the medicinal kanji in the future. Ling was dumbfounded. He couldn't keep up with his master's rhythm. After giving his orders, Xiao Su looked at the papers in his hand with satisfaction. The first rule of parenting was that children liked sweet things, so they could be coaxed with desserts occasionally. When Huang Yi received Ling's orders, she was also very confused. Lord disliked desserts and fruits the most, so why did he suddenly change his mind and prepare something for the Chu family's young miss today? But don't try to guess his master's thoughts. Huang Yi still obediently went to prepare. It was time for dinner. Chu Qingyan looked at Xiao Su walking towards her as if she was facing a formidable enemy. She couldn't help but tug at the quilt. Her heart was filled with endless sorrow. Another round of torture had begun. However, to her surprise, there was a small plate of candied fruits on the plate. She blinked and threw a question to Xiao Su. Xiao Su faintly said, medicinal cuisine is slightly bitter. Eat something sweet to dilute the taste. Chu Qingyan's eyes lit up when she heard this. This medicinal soup was too bitter. She didn't know if the person who wrote this recipe had some kind of grudge against her, but this medicinal soup was as bitter as eating cactus. She had long wanted some candied fruit, but because Xiao Su was here, she didn't dare to ask. Now that he had taken the initiative to consider it for her, she was very pleased. Seeing her unable to contain her joy, Xiao Su's lips curled into a satisfied smile. He would reward the general who gave the suggestion later. Picking up the bowl, Xiao Su didn't put it in her mouth like usual. He slowly blew on it and then brought it to her mouth. Chu Qingyan thought that he would abuse her like usual, but she never thought that he would be much gentler this time. Although she was suspicious of his change, she couldn't resist her hunger and began to eat in small bites. Seeing that she was eating obediently and didn't pester him to eat as she usually did, Xiao Su smiled again. He planned to give the rare saber that he had just received to the general who had told him to be gentle with children. Xiao Su looked at the furry head in front of him and his heart filled with a sense of accomplishment. This was different from winning a battle. This feeling was like an empty teacup being filled with warm tea. It was very comfortable. There's no rush. Eat slowly, Xiao Su said with a rare good temper. After finishing the bowl of rice, other than the feeling that Xiao Su gave her today, Chu Qingyan ate so happily after being poisoned for the first time. Xining put away the empty bowl, leaving only the two of them in the room. Because Xiao Su didn't like having too many servants in a room, even in Chu Qingyan's room, the two of them stared at each other. What are you thinking about? Xiao Su looked at the pair of black, grape-like eyes in front of him, and spoke to break the silence between the two of them. At this time, Chu Qingyan, who was holding the candied fruit and gorging herself, felt that Xiao Su had given her too many surprises tonight. First, he prepared the candied fruit, then he fed her gently, and finally he asked her what she was thinking. Tonight, Xiao Su was really too unimaginable. However, the person in front of her was still waiting for her answer, so Chu Qingyan braced herself and looked at him. Lord, do you want to hear the truth or a lie? What do you think? Xiao Su raised his eyebrows high. Perhaps it was because she was full and had a rare happy meal, but Chu Qingyan's mind was in a daze and she didn't notice Xiao Su's expression. After taking a bite of the candied fruit, she blurted out, Lord, to be honest, you're very strange today. Did something trigger you? Otherwise, why are you so good to Qingyan? Xiao Su's face darkened. Chu Qingyan took another bite of the candied fruit and continued to chatter, Lord, do you have something on your mind? Or is there something that can't be solved? Or is there something that you want Qingyan to do? Just say it. As long as it's something that Qingyan can do, I definitely won't refuse. Did she think that he was only good to her because he wanted to curry favor with her? Didn't she look at her small arms and legs? Even if there was something, how could she help? Xiao Su's face was already as dark as the bottom of a pot. It was just that she couldn't see it because it was covered by the mask. Otherwise, how could she have the guts to pluck the fur from the tiger's head? He decided that he would sneak to the border for that aide who was good at listening to the children's thoughts. Thinking about how Xiao Su didn't lose control of his strength to feed her like before, Chu Qingyan was faintly worried. She didn't forget to put another candied fruit into her mouth. Lord, are you sick? Is that why you don't have any strength? Do you want me to get a doctor to take a look? She thought about the doctor who appeared in front of her these 2 days. Although he was very cold to her and the medicine he prescribed was very bitter, she heard that he was the one who saved her from the gates of hell, so his medical skills should be good. Thus, she kindly suggested, Lord, do you want Ethereal to take Lord's pulse? The veins on Xiao Su's forehead bulged, and the corners of his eyes twitched. After muttering for a long time, Chu Qingyan finally remembered that the other party didn't seem to have responded to her until now. With the candied fruit in her mouth, she looked up at him in confusion. Lord, why aren't you saying anything? Xiao Su stood up abruptly, then flung his sleeves and left. Chu Qingyan patted her chest at his back. She was scared to death. This was Lord's true side, okay? Don't pretend to be a good person. Although he was still a good person with a cold aura, she still felt that domineering words were suitable for this cold lord. The 7th rule of parenting, don't lose your temper at your child. Thus, in order to control his emotions that were about to explode, Xiao Su chose to ignore her. Chapter 59. After Xiao Su left, Huang Yi came in with a plate of melons and fruits. Seeing Huang Yi, Chu Qingyan was in a good mood as she greeted her, older sister Huang, the candied plums you made are really delicious. She had a cute smile on her face. Huang Yi pursed her lips into a smile. Previously, she thought that she would blame her for poisoning her and was prepared to be punished, but she didn't expect that she would still treat her with a smile. Huang Yi felt that this child was more tolerant and magnanimous, so she treated her more attentively. This is this servant's duty. Huang Yi handed the plate of fruits in front of her. Chu Qingyan had already seen the red and purple bayberries that she was holding and was drooling with desire. Seeing this, she didn't hold back and took one and put it in her mouth. It was so sweet that it made people feel happy. Older sister Huang, you treat Qingyan just right. Thinking of the candied plums from before, Chu Qingyan thanked her with a smile. Huang Yi smiled as she shook her head. Lord specially ordered this servant to prepare those. Even these bayberries were just sent up by the servants. Lord took a look at them and had this servant send them here to satisfy your craving. Huang Yi thought of the cold air emitted from her master's body when he came out of this room. She guessed that this Chu family's young miss might have angered him, but when he heard older sister Hang's report, he didn't even think about it and had her send the bayberries over. The way these two masters interacted really made people very curious. The bayberries that had just entered her mouth got stuck in her throat and she almost couldn't breathe. Huang Yi was so scared that she immediately went forward to pat her back. Only then did Chu Qingyan forcefully cough it out. Huang Yi rebuked her and gave her a few words of advice before leaving to do her work. When she was the only one left in the room, her face revealed a rare blank expression. Only when she was alone would she let down her guard a little. She looked at the purple and black bayberries in her hand and was puzzled. Xiao Su, what kind of attitude did he have towards her? When they first met, she was cold and distant. After entering the residence, he had asked her to accompany him to eat and serve him with his brush and ink. She had repeatedly tested his bottom line, but it was always like punching cotton and was imperceptibly deflected by him. He personally taught her how to write. Although his demands were harsh, she didn't see that he disliked her dog-like handwriting. After being poisoned, he didn't leave her to fend for herself. Instead, he ordered someone to pull her out of the hands of the King of Hell. Shouldn't he be watching her being poisoned to death? Only then would he have a legitimate reason to abandon this marriage that everyone in the prince's residence was dissatisfied with. Why was he willing to lower himself to feed her? She had always felt the tolerance of the King of England's household towards her. This tolerance was not because they liked her, but because of the imperial edict, and they respected her perfunctorily. She had been waiting for them, to explode. Although she had suffered some small difficulties during this period of time, it was not enough to reach the apex. She seemed to be living a carefree life, but in fact, she was afraid in her heart. Because she was waiting for the unknown to erupt, she was still restless. It was as if he was trapped in a small world and could not move, with a sharp knife hanging from his neck that could fall at any time. She was not living an easy life. Her smile was pure and innocent, and her words were cute and interesting. She often acted ignorant and stupid, but it was just to relax their guard against her. But just as she was calculating the time and waiting for the knife to fall, Xiao Su's every move made her confused and unable to see the situation clearly. What was the elusive Xiao Su thinking? She was not narcissistic enough to think that she had what he wanted, or that she had a treasure map. Otherwise, how could he treat her differently? Unable to guess his thoughts, Chu Qingyan felt that the bayberries on the plate suddenly lost their color. She couldn't help but put this person on the bed and sighed. Did everyone who transmigrated have to face such a life of fear? Just because their souls were different, so they had to be wary of this different world? Her teeth were sore and soft. It should be because she ate too much bayberries. Chu Qingyan's expression was tired. She felt that there was still a fruity fragrance lingering in her mouth, so she couldn't help but give up. Forget it, it was better not to think too much about this kind of brain-wasting thing. She would take it one step at a time. She threw it to the back of her mind if she couldn't figure it out. Her cloud-like mood dissipated a lot. She touched the bayberry on the plate and put it into her mouth again. Life should be lived in a timely manner. What should come would come, and there was no need to rush it. What should come, would come. Thus, in the middle of the night, she had a high fever. Ethereal was dug up in the middle of the night, so he was in a bad mood. He retracted his fingers from Chu Qingyan's wrist and turned to respectfully say to his unhappy master, Miss Chu was poisoned this time, so her foundation is much worse. Perhaps it was the wind that caused the high fever. This subordinate will write a prescription for the servants to get the medicine, and the fever will subside soon. Go. Xiaosu waved his hand to dismiss him. After he left, Xiaosu looked at the pale-faced person on the bed. His gloomy mood from being angered by her today instantly dissipated. He only felt that her rosy complexion was more pleasing to the eye, but at this time, she was an eyesore. Lord, it's already late. You still have to attend the morning court tomorrow. Let Hong Yi take care of 9th Miss Chu. You should go rest early. Hong Yi stood at the side and said considerately. Cheng Yi, who was woken up, was very unhappy. She glanced at Chu Qingyan, and then continued Hong Yi's words, Sister Hong is right. A cold is very contagious. Lord, you should go rest. Leave this to us. No need. You can all leave. Leave 2 servant girls outside the door on standby. Xiaosu was unmoved. After Hong Yi and Cheng Yi looked at each other, they were very surprised. Did Lord want to stay and take care of Chu Qingyan? The news of Lord personally feeding her had already spread throughout the Wangfu. Now that he was so concerned, could it be that Lord really treated her as the future Wang Fei? So the 2 of them obeyed and left, each with their own thoughts. Chu Qingyan, who had a high fever, was very restless as she lay on the bed. Her hands were tightly gripping the quilt, and from time to time, she would wave her hands and mumble something that no one knew what. Seeing this, Xiaosu couldn't help but sit down. He reached out and stuffed her restless hands into the quilt. That slender hand that made people afraid of accidentally breaking it surprised Xiaosu. She really was a child. And a mischievous child. Although she was sick, her perception of the outside world didn't dull because of it. Instead, it seemed to be more sensitive. In the midst of chaos, Chu Qingyan felt a calming force beside her. She leaned in that direction in a daze. Xiaosu, who was deep in thought, suddenly felt a certain someone restlessly climb onto him. Looking down, he saw that she was struggling to get into his arms. Xiaosu simply put his hands between her ribs. With a bit of strength, he pulled her into his arms. When Chu Qingyan's body, which was alternating between cold and hot, touched this warm embrace, she sighed comfortably and stopped moving. Xiaosu lowered his head to look at the person who was peacefully curled up in his arms. Thinking of the happy scene of commoners holding children as they strolled through the streets, he couldn't help but curve his lips. It seemed that raising a child wasn't bad. Chapter 60. Ethereal yawned as he watched the servants brew the medicine. His expression was impatient, and the servants were so frightened that they didn't even dare to breathe loudly. Everyone knew that Lord Ethereal was Lord's personal doctor. Not only was his medical skills superb, but he was also good-looking. Everyone treated him with respect. He was in a bad mood now, so no one dared to make a sound. He should have been sleeping soundly at this time, but he was forced out of bed. If it was Lord, he would definitely be at his beck and call without complaint. But why was it a girl who was still wet behind the ears? Moreover, it was a cold that wasn't challenging at all. He was a doctor after all. Why did he have to treat such a trivial illness? Moreover, he had to personally take care of the medicine and deliver it. Wasn't this too much of a waste? But what could he do if Lord was interested in this girl? Thus, the arrogant doctor was discouraged. When Ethereal came in with the medicine bowl and saw this scene, he was instantly stunned. His first reaction was, it was the first time he saw a girl in Lord's arms. The Lord, who had never been close to girls since young, was finally willing to touch a girl. His second reaction was, what a scam. Why was this girl a 10-year-old child? My heart is so sad. Ethereal's mood fell like a cloud. Looking at the unconscious Chu Qingyan, a complicated look appeared in his eyes. Xiaosu saw him staring straight at her and narrowed his eyes. Ethereal quickly lowered his head and handed the medicine bowl over. Lord, let Miss Chu drink this bowl of medicine. After she sweats a little, her fever will go down. Xiao Su took the medicine and touched the bowl with his fingers. Feeling that it was a little hot, he blew on it a few times and prepared to feed it to her. Ethereal saw Lord and wanted to wake her up to drink the medicine. But for some reason, when his hand touched her arm, his eyes suddenly softened and he gently woke her up. Drink the medicine. Kongling felt as if he had been struck by lightning. Lord actually had a gentle side. He actually had a gentle side. He actually did. Xiao Su looked up, perhaps sensing the strangeness of Ethereal. What are you waiting for? The Lord had already given the order to chase them out. Ethereal immediately retreated. He wanted to find the fire spirit to talk about this matter. It was too terrifying. Recently, Chu Qingyan had gotten used to Xiao Su's cold and indifferent voice, so when she heard the familiar voice, she half opened her eyes in a daze and only saw a blurry silver mask. It was very familiar. Knowing that the other party would not hurt her, she let down her guard and obediently opened her mouth to let the other party feed her the medicine. Xiao Su's movements couldn't help but become gentler when he was sick and fragile. Chu Qingyan gulped down the bowl of medicine and drank it for nearly a quarter of an hour. Xiao Su took back the bowl and his sleeve inadvertently brushed past the corner of her lips. Chu Qingyan unconsciously used it as a tissue and grabbed the sleeve to wipe her mouth. The remaining liquid left a brown stain on his clothes. Xiao Su raised an eyebrow as he looked at the person blinking her large misty eyes. He was not angry. If it was any other day, he would have already thrown such a bold person out. Why are you so good to me? Perhaps it was because she was muddle-headed from her illness that she did not have her usual fear and caution. Chu Qingyan tilted her head and curiously asked the question that had been in her heart for the past 2 days. This king is happy. Xiao Su did not take the words of the sick person seriously and treated them as nonsense. However, he still paused for a while before spitting out these 4 words. This answer was in line with his personality. He did things as he pleased. Chu Qingyan let out a small sigh of relief. If it was like this, then there was nothing to worry about. Now that the medicine had taken effect, she began to feel sleepy again. She clasped her hands together and placed them in front of his chest. She found a comfortable position in his arms and peacefully closed her eyes. The person in his arms sleeping without any vigilance and the intimacy she had unconsciously displayed made the cold and hard wall in his heart collapse. Xiao Su gently stroked her hair. His eyes were filled with a warmth that he had never seen before. After sleeping for a while, Chu Qingyan slowly woke up. She had only opened half of her eyes when she saw a small figure pounce over at lightning speed. It was accompanied by a pleasantly surprised and aggrieved voice, "Master, you're finally awake. You scared this servant to death." Chu Qingyan did not need to think to know that it was Xining. She knew that she was the only one in the Fu who would make such a fuss. However, she was also someone who truly cared about her. She couldn't help but give a faint smile. "I'm fine. Don't worry." Seeing that her master's face was a little pale, but her spirit was fine, Xining finally relaxed. However, she was still a child in the end. She poured out the words that she had been holding back for the past few days. "Master, you don't know. These past few days, the Lord has personally taken care of you. Even when you had a high fever last night, the Lord didn't wear his clothes and stayed with you for the entire night. Just as he left, you woke up. Wait, the Lord said that as soon as you woke up, you should inform him." "Hey," before Chu Qingyan could call out to her, Xining had already disappeared. Xining said that Xiao Su took care of her for the entire night. So what she thought was a dream last night was actually real. She couldn't help being surprised. Did this iceberg lord have a change of heart? Why was he suddenly so good to her? If she wasn't a 10-year-old child, but had already reached marriageable age, perhaps she would think that he had taken a liking to her. However, that wasn't the case. She was poor and had nothing. What could she possibly have that he coveted? Could it be that it was really like what he said, that he was just acting on a whim? Just as she was letting her imagination run wild, the sound of steady footsteps came from afar. She knew that he had come. Sure enough, when she turned her head, a strong aura had already approached her bed. That tall figure had already leaned over. "Your fever has subsided." As he spoke, his hand was already on her forehead. The cold fingers brought her back to her senses. Much better." Chu Qingyan looked at the person close to her and obediently nodded. Xiao Su withdrew his hand and straightened his body. However, he didn't sit down on the stool that Xining had prepared for him. Instead, he looked at her with his hands behind his back. "Lord, I heard from Xining that this cold caused Lord to worry about you. Qingyan is very grateful. If there is a chance in the future, Qingyan will definitely repay Lord." Chu Qingyan looked at him and sincerely thanked him. No matter why he cared about her, what she felt right now, whether it was him saving her from the gates of hell or taking care of her, it all became his kindness. A single word of thanks wasn't enough to make up for it. "As long as you're obedient," Xiao Su calmly replied. If one really wanted to look into it, she was still implicated by him, which was why she encountered this unexpected disaster. Be obedient? Chu Qingyan felt that this answer was a bit perfunctory. Xiao Su seriously looked at the girl in front of him. Her watery eyes carried a trace of tiredness. Her normally rosy cheeks had lost a lot of weight because of the poison and illness. She was sickly pale and didn't look as pleasing to the eye as she did when she was full of vitality. "What do you want?" Xiao Su blurted out without thinking. When he saw her shocked expression, Xiao Su also felt that his words were a bit inconceivable. It wasn't like his usual style. However, words that were said were like water that was spilled, so he didn't plan on regretting it. Instead, he stared at her. "You're tuning into the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."